From abandonment to home. A German Shepherd's unbreakable thread. No one heard the engine sputter off, but a tired golden moon and a retired German Shepherd whose badge had been traded for motherhood. She watched her partner, her person, stare into the dark creek bed as though it could swallow every unpaid bill and broken dream he carried. At her feet, 9 pups squirmed, blind to the danger, gathering like frost. Miles whispered, "I'm sorry," into fur that once smelled of victory parades and airport terminals. He thought the night would keep his secret. He was wrong. 48 hours later, an elderly nurse named Isabel would kneel beside that same creek, scarf fluttering like a surrender flag, and whisper back the words that would crack open fate. "You're not alone. Sweet girl." The chain of choices forged that night would stretch across months, mending fences and hearts alike, proving that sometimes the road home begins the moment we're brave enough to admit we're lost. The engine clicked in protest as Miles turned the key to off, and silence fell like a guillotine. No music, no headlights, just the slow tick of a cooling engine and the wind whispering through the brittle branches overhead. He sat motionless behind the wheel of his rust-scarred pickup truck, parked beside a narrow logging trail that sloped down toward a shadow-laced creek. The only light came from a crescent moon, faint and fractured through the trees. Cold air filtered in through the cracked driver's window, but he made no move to roll it up. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned the color of bone. His breathing was shallow, uneven, a man staring over a cliff he'd already jumped from. Beside him in the passenger seat, Raya, his German Shepherd, lay quietly. Her head rested on the frayed edge of a cardboard box where 9 tiny bodies squirmed, squeaked, and blindly rooted for warmth. The box was lined with an old TSA security jacket, the last piece of his old job he hadn't sold or burned. One sleeve was folded like a pillow beneath the smallest pup, who barely had the strength to cry. Raya didn't whine. She didn't move. She only looked at Miles with those intensely alert amber eyes, the kind that seemed to see deeper than he was ready for. The kind of gaze that had stopped threats at terminals and kept her partner safe through crowded concourses, drug busts, and panic evacuations. Now, she watched him as if sensing something terrible was about to happen. And it was. The memories hit him like a blunt object, sudden and merciless. 2 years ago, he'd still been wearing that uniform with pride, working midnight shifts at O'Hare, clocking out just in time to get pancakes and bacon with Raya on the way home. She'd sit next to him in the booth, tail sweeping the vinyl seat every time the waitress brought more syrup. Then came the explosion in Concourse C. The torn hamstring. The months of limping through paperwork and pushing carts. HR said there was no more room for liability. "We thank you for your service." A handshake. A severance check that barely lasted the winter. Then the rent went. Then the gas. Then the fridge emptied. Then came the note tacked to his door. Foreclosure. He hadn't even opened it. Just left it fluttering there like a white flag. Miles looked down at his hands. They were shaking now. "I can't do this," he whispered, more to himself than anyone. But the truck was already parked. The box was packed. The night was too far along for turning back. He reached over and placed his palm gently on Raya's head. Her ears twitched slightly at his touch, but she didn't pull away. Her fur was still warm, still smelled faintly of cedar chips and dust. He scratched behind her ear, a ritual they'd shared since she was just a rookie, K9, all nerves and drive. "I'm sorry, girl," he said hoarsely. His throat caught on the words. For months, he had said nothing. Not to neighbors, not to the mirror, not even to her. But this night, was different. The final silence before everything fractured. Raya blinked slowly, her nose nudging his hand as if forgiving him before the crime. That made it worse. He looked at the puppies, 9 little souls he hadn't asked for, born 2 weeks ago when he had already stopped believing in tomorrow. The vet bills alone would have buried him. He couldn't even afford his own food. There had been nights, just last week, when he'd given Raya the last of the rice and slept on an empty stomach. She never hesitated to share with her pups. But tonight, he didn't have anything left. Not hope, not dignity, not even rage. Just a dark creek, a moonless sky, and a choice that hollowed him from the inside out. His eyes burned, but no tears fell. His body had grown too used to holding everything in. He reached for the door handle. It clicked open with the sound of finality. Cold air swept into the cabin like a warning. He stepped out, his boots crunching on frosted gravel. The smell of wet leaves and distant water filled his lungs. It felt like walking into a dream or a punishment. He rounded the front of the truck, opened the passenger door. Raya stood, hesitating for a heartbeat, then jumped down beside him, her body low and alert. She didn't bark, she didn't resist, but her steps were hesitant, her ears pinned slightly back. Somewhere in that trained mind of hers, she knew. He reached in, lifted the box slowly. The pups whimpered from the sudden movement, noses wiggling blindly against the edges of their cloth-lined cradle. The heat of their small bodies pulsed through the thin cardboard. For one insane second, Miles thought of turning back, of locking the truck, curling up with them, and just waiting for morning. But he kept walking. Each step down the slope felt heavier, the rocks slick underfoot. The darkness grew thicker between the trees. His breath came out in visible clouds, his fingers numbing as he held the box close to his chest. The creek whispered ahead, soft and indifferent, and behind him, Raya followed, loyal, despite everything. The box grew heavier with each step, though its actual weight hadn't changed. It was still cardboard, still lined with that worn-out security jacket, still filled with the soft, helpless bodies of 9 blind puppies who didn't know the world had already failed them. But for Miles, it felt like he was carrying his own heart inside that box, and every beat of it was cracking. The path down to the creek was uneven, a patchwork of wet leaves and moss-covered stones that tugged at his balance. He moved like a man underwater. His boots slipped once, jolting the box in his hands. A tiny whimper rose from inside, so small it barely registered in the wind, but it cut through him like a blade. Behind him, Raya followed silently, her paws making no sound on the forest floor. Her ears were pulled slightly back, tail low but steady. She didn't bark, didn't protest. She just followed the man she trusted, because that was who she was. That was who she had always been. And it was that silent loyalty, that unquestioning presence that made this unbearable. They reached the clearing by the creek, a hollowed-out spot where the trees bowed inward, like sentinels mourning something unspeakable. The moon had dipped behind clouds now, leaving the forest to its shadows. Water gurgled softly nearby, indifferent, unfeeling. Miles set the box down at the base of an old oak, its roots thick like twisted veins crawling over the damp earth. The moment his hands left the cardboard, a coldness surged through him. Not the cold of the wind, but the kind that starts in the chest and spreads like rot. He stepped back and stood still, watching. The puppies stirred. One yawned. Another let out a soft, suckling noise. They were nestled together in instinctive formation, a fragile bundle of breathing warmth. Miles couldn't breathe. Raya stepped forward, nose to the edge of the box. She let out a low, broken whine, the kind he hadn't heard from her since the first time they were separated during a sweep. He remembered that day clearly. She had thrashed in the kennel, barked until her voice cracked. They'd had to sedate her. But tonight, she didn't fight. She didn't lunge or protest. She just looked at him. Her eyes shimmered in the dark, and they said everything. Why? His hands curled into fists. He turned away. "I'm doing this for you," he muttered, voice shaking. "You'll be better off without me." It sounded so hollow, so rehearsed, as if he'd been telling himself that line for days, hoping one day it might feel true. It didn't. He walked a few steps toward the truck, then stopped, looked back. Raya had curled her body around the box, draping her torso over the side so her warmth could reach the puppies. Her breathing was shallow but steady. The tips of her ears twitched as the wind shifted. She was alert, guarding even now. Even here. A mother. A soldier. Alone in the dark. A sob built in Miles's throat, and he swallowed it down like poison. He couldn't fall apart now. If he did, he'd never leave. And if he didn't leave, they'd all go down together. He wasn't afraid to die. He was just afraid of dragging them with him. He forced himself to move, step by step, back toward the truck. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. His lungs burned. When he reached the driver's side, he opened the door too hard. It slammed into the frame and echoed into the trees. Raya didn't flinch. He slid into the seat, gripped the wheel with both hands, tried not to look in the rearview mirror. Failed. In the dim reflection, He saw her standing over the box like a sentinel in the snow, her golden coat barely visible in the dark, but her silhouette unmistakable. And those eyes, they glowed faintly, like twin embers refusing to go out. She barked once, soft, not angry, almost pleading, and it shattered him. He pressed his forehead to the wheel, tears falling now, hot and soundless. His whole body shook with it. The kind of grief that comes when a man chooses to break his own soul because he believes there's no other way. "I'm sorry," he choked. "I'm so sorry." But he didn't get out, didn't run back. Instead, with trembling hands, he turned the key. The engine growled awake, loud and wrong in the stillness of the forest. He threw it into gear, foot on the pedal, and drove. The wheels spun against wet leaves. The truck lurched forward, headlights slicing through trees. He didn't look back again. He couldn't, but in his mind, the image stayed. Raya, in the dark, the box, the pups, her eyes. A silent goodbye carved into the ribs of memory. The deeper he drove into the trees, the more the shadows felt like chains. He kept wiping his face, but the tears wouldn't stop. His chest ached with every breath. Somewhere behind him, a dog stayed loyal to the last second and still chose her babies over chasing him. That would haunt him longer than anything. The sound of the truck's engine faded into the distance, a dying roar swallowed by the forest. Then came the silence. It wasn't a peaceful kind. It was hollow, wide, final. Raya stood motionless, her paws pressed into the damp earth, her breath visible in the cold air. The box of puppies behind her rustled gently, tiny bodies shifting in their sleep, unaware of the absence that had just hollowed out the world. The last of the truck's red taillights blinked out beyond the trees. Gone. She did not chase it. She didn't whimper or bark. She simply turned and walked back to her babies. The cardboard box had started to sag slightly on one corner, softening from the dampness of the ground. The old security jacket lining it offered some insulation, but the night air was too sharp, too hungry. The puppies huddled tighter, their small bodies twitching instinctively for warmth, for comfort, for her. Raya climbed inside slowly, with the practiced care of a mother who knew every inch of her children's weight. She curled her body around them, creating a wall of fur and muscle and breath to fight off the cold. Her spine curved protectively over their tiny forms, her tail wrapped beneath them like a scarf. And still, they whimpered. She nuzzled them gently, licking one behind the ear, adjusting another with her nose. She worked in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew that in the wilderness, sound was a beacon, and tonight they were not safe. The wind stirred again, rattling dry leaves in the canopy above. A distant owl hooted once, a long, low call that sent a ripple through the underbrush. Raya's ears flicked forward, then sideways. Her nostrils flared, her eyes scanned the trees. Somewhere out there, things watched, moved. She didn't need to see them to know. A fox, a coyote, maybe worse. Hunger moved with claws in the woods. It could smell weakness, and there was so much weakness here. She shifted slightly, pushing her ribs against the pups, warming them with the furnace of her body. Her paws stayed anchored, ready. She would not sleep. Not yet. The moon peeked through a break in the clouds, casting a soft silver light over the creek and the crumpled forest floor. For a moment, everything seemed frozen, like a still frame in a sad, forgotten film. And in the center of it all, Raya lay glowing. Her golden coat, though dirt-streaked and thinning from stress, shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Her eyes, wide, alert, and aching, reflected the silver sky like mirrors, not just glowing, burning, with fear, with devotion, with something almost sacred. It was the kind of image that didn't need words. A mother alone in the wild, guarding what little she had left, not because she was told to, not because anyone would thank her, but because that was who she was. The pup stirred again. One squeaked, another crawled blindly up her foreleg, nuzzling into her throat. She angled her chin down, tucking the little one beneath her. Her breathing slowed, but never fully relaxed. Her ears remained perked, turning toward every crack of a twig, every shuffle in the distance. The wind picked up, colder now, more urgent. Clouds covered the moon again. The clearing dimmed into shadow. Raya tightened her body, bracing the box from one side, her hips from the other. Her chest heaved against the sides, but she didn't move. Her body was trembling now. Not from fear, from exhaustion, but still, she stayed. Minutes dragged into hours. The creek kept whispering. Leaves shifted like whispers. Time passed the way it does when you're afraid to close your eyes, slow, endless, cruel. She didn't know if he'd come back. The one who had stood by her side in airport terminals, who had called her partner, who had rubbed behind her ears after every shift and whispered, "You did good, girl." He hadn't said that tonight. He hadn't looked back. But Raya hadn't chased him, because she had her own to protect now. Her chest rose and fell in slow rhythm, her breath puffing into the cold like smoke signals. The world had gone quiet again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. In the dark, the pups began to settle. Their tiny sounds softened into breath. One hiccuped in his sleep. Another let out a squeak, then quieted. Raya finally lowered her head onto the damp earth beside them, her eyes still open, still watching, always watching. But in those last seconds before her lids drifted shut, the fear faded just enough to let something else in. Not comfort, not safety, but something close to it. A flicker. A flicker of something warm in the bitter wind, of something holding on, tooth and nail, against the unraveling world. And it lived here in this box, in this clearing, in her, a mother, a fighter, a soldier left behind, still refusing to abandon her young. The morning air was brittle, the kind that turned breath into fog and made every inhale feel like a small apology to the lungs. Isabel Quinn tucked her scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped onto the forest trail, her boots leaving soft indentations in the frost-laced ground. A thermos of lukewarm tea sloshed quietly in her coat pocket, its presence more ritual than necessity. The sun had only just begun to climb, a thin sliver of gold splitting the eastern tree line. It painted everything with a reluctant light, not quite warm, not yet hopeful. Isabel liked these kinds of mornings. Quiet, solitary, before the world asked anything of her. She came here almost every day. The trail behind her modest home snaked toward the edge of the creek a half-mile down, a place where birds liked to nest and the deer sometimes wandered through. She'd spent years memorizing this path, ever since her retirement from nursing 3 winters ago. It gave her space to think, and space to forget. Today, her knees ached more than usual, and the sky had that dull steel tint that whispered snow might fall before evening. Still, she walked, because walking helped. Always had. She passed the crooked fence post, the one that had splintered in last spring's storm. She noted the shape of a squirrel's paw prints in the dirt. She let her mind drift as it often did to the man she used to walk this trail with, 10 years gone now. But sometimes, if she breathed deeply enough, she swore she could still smell his cologne in the pines. That was when she heard it. A sound soft, erratic, unfamiliar. Isabel stopped. Birds? Maybe. But not quite. These were too rhythmic, too urgent. Not chirps, not calls. Cries. High-pitched, weak, almost wet. She turned her head, narrowing her eyes. The sound came from just beyond the bend, where the trees grew thicker and the trail dipped closer to the water. A fox kit? She hesitated. Then it came again, a cluster of tiny, keening whimpers, faint but unmistakable. Her nurse's instincts stirred before her feet even moved. She gripped the strap of her bag and stepped off the trail, weaving through the brush, following the sound like a string tied to her ribs. Another whimper. Then a rustle. Then silence. The clearing appeared like a secret place, tucked beneath a canopy of half-bare trees. The morning light filtered through in streaks, illuminating patches of frost and fallen leaves. The ground dipped toward the shallow creek that gurgled quietly in the background. And there, beneath a gnarled oak, was something that made Isabel's breath catch in her throat. A box, flattened slightly on one side, its edges damp from the earth. Inside, movement, tiny bodies, squirming, crying. And curled around it all like a golden shield, a dog. A German shepherd, coated in dirt and leaf litter, her ribs faintly visible beneath her fur. Her ears perked at Isabel's presence, her body tensing. But she didn't stand. She didn't growl. She just looked. Eyes the color of old whiskey, not wild, not feral, wary, guarded, exhausted. And then Isabel saw it clearly. The dog wasn't alone. There were puppies, at least half a dozen, maybe more, nestled inside the box and along their mother's side. Some suckled blindly, others whimpered and rooted for warmth, all of them far too young to be without shelter. Isabel's heart twisted. She didn't speak at first. She simply knelt slowly, keeping her movements fluid, her body low. Years in trauma wards had taught her how to approach fear without feeding it. The shepherd's eyes followed her, unmoving. "It's okay," Isabel said softly, barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her voice cracked slightly from cold or emotion. She didn't know. She sat on her heels, letting her breath even out. Reaching slowly into her coat, she pulled out half a granola bar, broken and crumbling at the edges. She extended it in an open palm. The dog flinched at the motion but didn't run. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of food. The shepherd sniffed, ears twitching. A long moment passed. Then, with aching slowness, she lifted her head and took one shaky step forward. She sniffed Isabel's hand, paused, then took the offered bite, gently, without teeth. Her muzzle barely brushed Isabel's skin. "There you go, Mama," Isabel murmured, tears stinging her eyes. "That's it." The shepherd sat back down, her tail curling around the pups. But her eyes never left Isabel's. They were saying something. Not in words, but in something older, something bone deep. "Don't take them. Don't take me. Please." Isabel unwrapped her scarf, thick and woolen, and gently laid it across the box, tucking in one corner to cover the smallest pup. The motion made the shepherd's ears twitch again, but she didn't object. The puppies let out soft, sleepy grunts. One let out a tiny hiccup and snuggled deeper beneath the scarf. "You don't have to do this alone," Isabel whispered, not sure if she was speaking to the dog or to herself. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then, slowly, the shepherd lay her head back down, one eye still open, and let out a deep, trembling sigh. The moment Isabel reached to adjust the scarf over the smallest pup, a low growl rose from Raya's throat. Not sharp, not threatening, but primal, protective, raw. The sound vibrated from somewhere deep in the dog's chest, a trembling chord of maternal instinct wrapped in exhaustion. Isabel froze. She didn't recoil. She didn't speak immediately. She simply lowered her hand and kept her body soft, gaze averted, just like she used to do with trauma patients in the ER, the ones too scared to speak, too hurt to trust. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered, voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You're a good mama. I'm not here to take them." Raya's ears pinned slightly. Her body tensed, coiled like a wire stretched too far. Her breath came shallow, nostrils flaring. Her golden eyes locked onto Isabel's every move, not with aggression, but with the fierce despair of someone with nothing left to lose. Isabel slowly reached into her coat pocket again and pulled out what remained of the granola bar. She broke off another piece, as small as a coin, and placed it carefully on the ground just a foot away from her knee. "I'll leave it here for you," she said softly, not expecting anything. "Just in case." Then she waited. The wind picked up slightly, scattering leaves around their feet. The pups wriggled beneath the scarf, soft mewling noises rising like steam into the cold air. For a long time, nothing happened. Isabel sat still, knees aching, fingers stinging from the cold, heart pounding in a rhythm she hadn't felt since her final code blue shift at the hospital. And then, Raya moved. Not much, just the front paw. Then another. Her body stayed low, shoulders hunched, but she inched forward one careful step, then another. The growl faded into silence. She sniffed the air, jaw tight. Then, slowly, with eyes never leaving Isabel's face, she leaned forward and took the piece of granola in her mouth. She didn't chew it right away. She backed up first, sat beside her pups again, then swallowed. Tense seconds passed. Then, to Isabel's surprise, Raya laid her head down beside the smallest pup. The growl didn't return. "I see you," Isabel whispered. And I know you're doing everything you can." The emotion crept up fast, like a tide rising behind the ribs. Isabel swallowed hard, blinked against the sting. Something about the sight of this gaunt mother, her coat matted with mud, her eyes burning with a love that refused to break. It cracked something open in Isabel that had been sealed for years. She remembered what it was to sit at the bedside of a young mother who lost her baby to pneumonia. She remembered the old man who died clutching his wedding band, whispering a name no one else in the room recognized. She remembered what it felt like to be helpless but to show up anyway. That was what this dog was doing, showing up with nothing left. No strength, no help, no guarantee. Just love, and the sheer, stubborn refusal to leave her babies behind. Isabel reached forward again, slower this time, and gently tucked the scarf around the second pup. It stirred, let out a tiny sigh, and nestled deeper. Raya lifted her head but didn't growl. Her ears twitched, her gaze sharp, but she remained where she was. "That's it," Isabel said softly. "Good girl." She unzipped her coat halfway and pulled out the thin emergency blanket she always carried, old habit from her nursing days. She spread it out beside her knees, creating a dry space between the cold earth and the box. "I know it's not much," she murmured, "but it's warmer than this dirt." She eased the box carefully, respectfully onto the blanket. The pups mewled in protest at the movement, but quickly settled again under the scarf. Raya stood halfway then, body low but alert. She didn't interfere, didn't bite or bark, just watched. And then, something happened. She took a step closer. Just one. Then, another. She reached Isabel's side, her paws brushing the edge of the blanket. Her body trembled, not with fear, but fatigue. The bones beneath her fur jutted out like thin scaffolding. Without a word, Isabel extended the back of her hand. Raya sniffed it. Long, slow. And then she did the unthinkable. She leaned her head into Isabel's palm. For a second, Isabel couldn't breathe. She felt the weight of that gesture in her bones, like someone had handed her a secret too sacred to speak aloud. She let her hand rest gently on Raya's head, fingers threading through the tangled fur behind her ears. "You're not alone," she whispered, voice cracking. "Not anymore." Raya exhaled one long, shaky breath and curled herself back around her pups. Her body pressed close to the scarf, her nose nudging one pup closer, her tail wrapped instinctively around the others. Isabel sat there, hands still resting lightly on the mother's side, tears sliding down her cheeks. The sky above them had begun to shift, less gray now, touched faintly by morning gold. A bird chirped in the distance. But down here, in the quiet of the trees, something holy had taken place. A bond, a beginning, a silent promise exchanged between species, both equally bruised by life, both still choosing to protect what they could. The forest was still wrapped in a hush that only comes with falling snow. Flakes drifted gently from the pale sky, catching the early light like ash from some sacred fire above. The cold had softened, not gone, but quieter, and Isabel could feel it in her breath, warm against her scarf as she exhaled. She stood slowly, arms curled around the box. Inside, the pups were huddled tight, their tiny chests rising in rhythm beneath the scarf. Isabel adjusted the edge to keep them warm and dry. The cardboard was damp on the bottom, its weight awkward, but she held it like something precious, a cradle, not cargo. "Come on, girl," she said softly. Raya didn't move at first. Her golden eyes blinked once, then again. Her body seemed carved from stone, still, silent, unsure. But then she rose. Her back legs trembled. She placed one paw forward, then another. She limped, slight, but visible. Isabel could see now how thin she really was, the way each step cost her more than she let on. Still, Raya walked, because her babies were walking, because the stranger carrying them had earned something, not everything, but enough. They walked slowly, the three of them, woman, mother, and the fragile bundle between them, along the narrow dirt trail that twisted beside the creek. The snow muffled the world. Trees stood silent in their winter coats. Branches dipped gently under the weight of frost. Each step left a delicate imprint that would soon be covered again. Raya kept close to Isabel's side, ears alert but low, her body angled protectively toward the box. She paused at every sudden sound, a distant rustle, A crow's call, the creak of bark overhead, and then, reassured by the quiet, limped onward. Isabel glanced down at her often. "You're brave," she murmured. "So much braver than people think." Raya didn't look at her, but she stayed. Halfway back, they passed the old wooden bridge that crossed over the stream. Isabel stopped there for a moment, just to breathe. The water below ran slow, thick with slush, and steam rose faintly where it met the cold air. Her breath fogged her glasses, and she wiped them with her sleeve, careful not to jostle the pups. Behind her, Raya dipped her head to sniff the frozen planks, tail lowered. She lingered there for a beat, her body trembling with exhaustion, then crossed. Isabel waited until they were together again before moving on. The trail narrowed as they left the woods. Ahead, through the sparse line of trees, her cottage came into view, a small home with peeling white shutters and a crooked chimney that always leaned left after the first snow. It sat alone at the edge of town, tucked against the hillside like it was trying not to be seen. Isabel had chosen it that way. Quiet. Far enough from people, close enough to memory. It was the kind of place where time didn't rush, where grief could sit beside you at the table, and no one asked it to leave. She looked over at Raya. "We're almost there." The dog didn't respond, but her ears twitched at Isabel's voice. The final stretch was a short climb through shallow snow. Isabel's boots sank slightly with every step, and her arms began to ache from the weight of the box. But she didn't complain. Not once. Behind her, Raya staggered. Her paw slipped on a patch of ice, and she let out a sharp breath, not quite a whimper, but enough for Isabel to hear. She stopped, knelt. "It's okay," she said. "Just a little further." She reached into her coat and took out the last piece of her granola bar. Broke it again, held it out. Raya sniffed it, took it gently. Then, as if fueled by that single, small act of kindness, she took another step. The porch creaked beneath Isabel's boots as they arrived. She set the box down first, right beside the welcome mat that had long since lost its letters. Then she turned and opened the door. Warm air spilled out, scented with wood smoke and something faintly floral. Inside, the fireplace glowed, logs cracking gently. A stack of books lined one windowsill. A kettle steamed quietly on the stove. It wasn't much, but to someone who had known only trees, frost, and fear, it might as well have been a sanctuary. Raya paused at the threshold. She looked at Isabel, then at the pups. Her body trembled not from cold now, but uncertainty. Would she be allowed in? Was this for her too? Isabel didn't say anything. She stepped aside and held the door open. Raya stepped in. Inside, Isabel placed the box gently on a folded towel near the hearth. The pups stirred, warm now, their tiny bodies sighing with contentment. Raya walked slowly to them and laid down, curling her body protectively around the box's edge. Her nose nudged the scarf again. Her breathing began to even out. Isabel watched her for a long time. Then, without a word, she took off her coat, hung it by the door, and went to prepare a bowl of warm broth. Tonight, she wouldn't eat alone. The morning light had shifted by the time Isabel placed the last towel beside the fireplace. Snowlight filtered through the kitchen window, soft and pale, brushing the room with a kind of hush that felt sacred. It smelled faintly of cedar and clean linen, the scent of effort, care, and the quiet promise of refuge. In the far corner, beneath the window where ivy vines once grew in summer, Isabel had laid down a folded patchwork quilt faded from age, stitched with uneven hands, but warm. On top of it, a thick towel sat warming gently beneath a low heater, its coils faintly glowing. She bent slowly, knees cracking, and arranged the blanket again until it looked more like a nest than a bed. Not perfect, but gentle, soft, safe. Raya watched every movement from across the room, body low to the ground, paws tucked under her chest, golden eyes fixed on the pups. Her breathing was steady, but her eyes, they never stopped scanning. Not even once. Isabel had fed them once already clumsy, careful drops of milk formula she'd found in the back of her cabinet. It was meant for kittens, expired by a month, but it would have to do until she could reach the vet. One by one, she'd taken the pups from the box and cradled them in her palm like tiny, fragile stones, guiding the dropper to their lips. Now she sat beside the nest, the towel-wrapped pups cradled in a soft bowl lined with flannel. They squirmed quietly, pink tongues flicking at the air, eyes still sealed shut. Their breaths came fast and light, like whispers against the fabric. Isabel held one gently, her fingers curled beneath its belly. Rhea growled. Not loud, not angry, just low enough to say, "I'm watching." Isabel looked up. "I know," she said softly, "but they need more than watching right now." She lifted the dropper again. The puppy latched, suckling clumsily, a tiny ripple of life in her wrinkled hand. Rhea crept closer, slowly. Her body tense, but not aggressive. Her paw stepped onto the edge of the quilt, then another. She was only inches away now, her muzzle hovering near Isabel's elbow, close enough to stop her if she wanted. But she didn't. She just watched. Isabel offered the pup one last drop, then laid it carefully back into the flannel bowl. "You did good, Mama," she whispered. Rhea didn't respond, but her ears flicked once a silent acknowledgement. The room felt warmer now. Or maybe it was Isabel's chest, thawing in slow ripples. She leaned back on her heels and exhaled, watching as the pups nestled deeper into the warmth of the towel. Their movements were so small, barely noticeable, but she watched them like they were miracles, because in a way, they were. They shouldn't have made it through that night. They shouldn't have survived the cold, or the creak, or the ache in that man's eyes as he left them behind. But somehow, they had. Isabel stood and went to the sink, rinsing out the dropper with warm water. Her fingers trembled more than usual. Maybe it was the strain, or the memories rising uninvited from deep beneath the layers of routine she'd wrapped herself in. It had been years since she'd lost Michael. A heart attack, sudden, no warning, just a silence that never ended. She remembered those days after the way the house had felt too big, too empty, how she'd stopped using the front room altogether, avoiding the space where his reading chair still sat. And then came the slow days. Then slower, until all the clocks in the house felt like they ticked in apology. She didn't cry anymore. Not really. But moments like this, the weight of life so small and urgent in her hands, they stirred something. Maybe it wasn't pain. Maybe it was presence. She returned to the nest, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Her knees ached, but she didn't care. Rhea was now lying beside the pups, her body curled protectively around them. Her breathing had deepened not quite sleep, but a surrender. The kind that comes only when someone decides, quietly, that they are no longer alone. Isabel didn't reach out. Not yet. Trust was a slow thing. Instead, she watched them. And for the first time in a long time, she felt useful again. Not just busy, not just needed by habit, but called by something old and wordless. She whispered into the room, to no one in particular. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Snow fell again, outside the window. Not harsh, not wild. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps a home like a lullaby. Inside, a woman and a dog lay inches apart, watching over a life too young to understand how much it had already overcome. But Isabel knew, and so did Rhea. The kettle whistled gently in the background, its rising steam curling like a ghost above the stove. Isabel didn't move to turn it off right away. She sat on the floor beside the hearth, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the quilt where the puppies lay curled, belly up and milk-drunk, dreaming their tiny newborn dreams. Rhea lay stretched just behind them, her breathing slow, her ribs rising and falling like the tide. Her fur had dried, fluffing unevenly in places, and her paw twitched now and then, some invisible memory stirring beneath the surface. Isabel's hand had gone still. She wasn't petting, just resting, waiting, respecting the silence. The room was dim, the last light of the day slipping behind the hills beyond the cottage. Shadows stretched long across the floor, interrupted only by the flicker of the fireplace, where a single log popped gently, a warm sound, like a tired sigh. Rhea stirred, not fully, just enough to shift her front paw, inching closer toward the patch of Isabel's skirt that touched the edge of the quilt. Then, slowly, deliberately, Rhea lifted her head and placed it gently onto Isabel's lap. Time didn't stop, but Isabel did. Her breath caught in her throat, as if someone had gently pressed pause on the noise in her chest. The warmth of the dog's head was soft and heavy through the fabric of her old corduroy pants. She could feel the tension still thrumming beneath the fur, the ever-alert twitch of a muscle waiting to flee. But Raya didn't pull back. She stayed. Isabel's hand hovered for a moment. Then, with the kind of slowness usually reserved for sacred things, old letters, wedding albums, prayer candles, she let her palm settle lightly over the dog's neck. She didn't stroke. She didn't speak. She just rested her hand there, like a promise. "I see you. I won't make you prove anything." For a long while, neither moved. The pups made a soft chorus of whimpers beside them. The room swaddled in their innocent sounds. The kettle had long gone quiet. Outside, the last of the light disappeared. Snow pressed against the windows like white fog, soft and thick. And in the silence, Isabel's mind wandered not away, but inward, like a tide returning to shore. She thought of James, her husband. She hadn't spoken his name aloud in almost a year, but tonight, with a German shepherd's head on her lap, the memory rose like smoke. He used to rescue strays. Not formally, not through shelters or phone calls, just naturally. If a dog was limping near the gas station, he'd come home with it. If a cat meowed under the porch, there'd be a saucer of milk on the step before sunset. He said he couldn't fix the world, but he could fix a wound, could warm a bed, could sit quietly until trust returned. She remembered the last dog he brought home, a brown mutt, missing half an ear, named Percy. Percy had slept at the foot of their bed every night until James passed, then moved to the hallway as if to guard the absence itself. He'd only stayed another month. Dogs understood grief like few humans ever could. They didn't try to fix it. They just stayed near until the silence stopped echoing. Isabel's eyes grew glassy. She blinked hard and looked down. Raya's eyes were closed now, her breath warm against Isabel's thigh. And then a small thing, almost nothing, the dog's tongue flicked out once, brushing the back of Isabel's hand in a single, soft, grateful lick. Like a whisper, like a handshake between souls. It broke something gently open. Not pain, but memory. The kind you don't run from the kind you sit with. Isabel smiled, just barely, and finally let her fingers move. She scratched softly behind Raya's ear, murmuring under her breath like she was speaking to the fire itself. "You miss someone too, don't you?" The dog didn't answer, but her body relaxed, the way only a mother who knows her babies are warm can relax. And in that moment, Isabel felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just comfort, company. Later, she would remember this moment as the beginning, not when she found Raya by the creek, not when she carried them home, but here, the first time the space between them wasn't filled with fear, only breath, and the slow, careful stitching of a bond being mended. Not with words, but with presence, with trust, with a head resting in an old woman's lap beneath the glow of a fire and the hush of snow. The snow had let up by the time evening settled again over the quiet edge of town. Isabel's little cottage, tucked into a grove of fir trees and outlined in frost, glowed softly from the hearthlight within. Outside, the world was still not silent, but hushed, like even the wind knew something sacred was unfolding between old pain and newborn breath. Inside, a kettle bubbled low, its warmth mingling with the sweet smell of milk formula and the faint scent of pine logs. The corner by the fireplace had become its own universe. A patchwork quilt stretched across the floor, forming a makeshift den. Nestled in its folds were 4 tiny pups squirming, yawning, snoring. In short, rhythmic puffs. Their bellies were full, their bodies warm, their lives barely begun. Raya lay behind them, curled protectively with one eye half open. Her ears twitched now and then, alert to the smallest sound, a shift in Isabel's chair, a change in the wind, the creak of old floorboards. But she didn't rise. She didn't growl. Her tail, in fact, gave the barest hint of a wag when Isabel returned from the kitchen with a warm cloth. "You're starting to trust me," Isabel said softly, crouching beside the group. "A little, anyway." She reached down, not to pet Raya, but to nudge one of the wriggling pups back into the bundle of his siblings. The little one had wandered sideways, eyes still sealed shut, a whimper barely rising from his throat. "You," she murmured, smiling. "You're a wanderer." The pup sneezed, and that was it. That was the moment. A name formed in her mind. "Scout," she whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of his head. She didn't plan to name them, didn't intend to go past the role of rescuer, but it was too late now. The moment she saw Scout veer off course like he had somewhere important to be, something maternal stirred in her, something that had been buried deep but never lost. She looked over the others. The smallest of the litter, a little puff of cream-colored fluff, had been the first to latch on to the dropper. Persistent, determined, but always the one who cried out when separated, even for a moment. "You're Pip," Isabel whispered, smiling as she tucked him close to Raya's side. Next was a sleek, dark female, her fur nearly black, but with a silvery streak along her spine. She was the quietest, almost regal in the way she moved. "Luna," Isabel said. "You're made of moonlight." And finally, the big boy. He'd already claimed the corner of the blanket like it belonged to him. He flopped there now, belly up, feet twitching in a dream battle he was clearly winning. "Tank?" Isabel chuckled. "Because subtlety is not your gift." Raya's head lifted slightly at the sound of the names. Her ears swiveled. When Isabel repeated them softly, she watched with mild interest. And when Isabel said Raya, the shepherd's tail tapped once hesitant, but real. "Good girl," Isabel whispered, her voice cracking ever so slightly. "You're starting to hear yourself again." Later that night, Isabel sat alone in her rocking chair, the blanket over her knees. The fire was low but steady, throwing long shadows across the walls. The puppies were asleep again, full bellies, twitching paws, tiny noses nestled together like a bouquet of breathing blossoms. Raya had settled beside them, her head resting gently on her front paws. Her breathing had finally deepened into something that resembled rest. Isabel cradled a mug of tea in her hands, but it had gone cold without her noticing. Her eyes weren't on the fire anymore. They were staring past it, through it, as if trying to burn through time itself to make sense of what she still couldn't understand. She shook her head slowly. "Who could have left you like that?" she whispered into the flickering light. "With babies, in the snow, as if your life, their lives, were something to walk away from." The room didn't answer. Only the fire crackled in response, and a knot in her chest pulsed with an ache she hadn't expected to resurface. She thought of the moment she first saw them, that tight circle of fur and fear, those golden eyes guarding against the world. She imagined what might have happened had she walked a different trail that day. If she'd slept in, if she'd ignored the cry, they'd be gone, her heart said bluntly. Frozen, forgotten, buried beneath a story no one told. Her throat tightened. She blinked hard and forced herself to breathe through the burn in her eyes. She looked at Raya, who, as if sensing the storm in the room, opened one eye and met her gaze. There was no hostility now, just quiet. A mother guarding her post. A survivor beginning to see kindness as more than a trap. "I don't know who you were running from," Isabel murmured. "But you're safe now. You hear me, sweetheart? You're safe." Raya didn't move, but her tail gave the softest thump against the floor. Once, then twice. And that was answer enough. The snow had melted into brittle patches now, the kind that clung stubbornly in shadows behind the porch steps, along the fence posts, where the sun never quite reached. Winter was loosening its grip on the sleepy edge of town, but the cold still clung to the early mornings, like a memory that refused to let go. Inside Isabel's cottage, the fire had long since burned down to soft coals. Morning light pooled through the kitchen window in faint gold ribbons, brushing across the worn pine floor, over the rocking chair, and toward the quilted corner, where 4 pups now tumbled in messy joy. They were louder now, stronger, eyes wide, paws steady. They barked at nothing and everything, shoelaces, chair legs, their own tails. Isabel had rearranged the furniture just to give them more room to exist, to play, to live. But Raya wasn't playing. Not this morning. Isabel stood by the counter, cradling a chipped mug between her palms, steam rising from her tea in slow tendrils, and watched as Raya paced back and forth by the front door. It had started before dawn. First, a soft whine. Then the circling. Then the bark. Not the panicked kind, not even defensive. It was sharper than that, urgent and unsettled, as if something invisible had entered the space and only she could sense it. Now, Raya was planted by the door, head low, tail stiff, ears darting at every shift in the wind. Her golden eyes flicked between the doorknob and the trees beyond the glass. "She hasn't touched her breakfast," Isabel murmured. The pups were oblivious, rolling, nibbling, squeaking at each other in a miniature storm of chaos. But Raya was somewhere else entirely. It was the fourth lap past the window when Isabel finally set her mug down and moved toward the door. "You're not like this for no reason," she said softly, more to herself than to the dog. She reached for her coat, then hesitated, eyeing Raya's posture alert but restrained, like a soldier waiting for permission. She opened the door slowly. A gust of wind rushed in biting and full of pine and memory. Raya stepped forward, then stopped. She looked back at Isabel. No bark this time, no whine, just a gaze so steady and imploring. Isabel could almost hear the thought behind it. "I need you to see." "All right," Isabel sighed. "I'm coming." She grabbed her scarf, looped it once around her neck, and tucked a granola bar into her coat pocket, just in case. Not that she knew where they were going, or why. Outside, the wind carried whispers through the trees. The snow was thin but still crunched faintly beneath their boots and paws. The path beyond the cottage sloped gently downhill, toward the tree line, toward the creek, and Isabel realized that was where Raya was headed, back to where it started. For the first several minutes, neither of them made a sound. Isabel kept close, matching the shepherd's pace. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic, but it had direction. Deliberate. Every so often, Raya would stop, sniff the air, and glance back, checking that Isabel was still following. The woods looked different now, less threatening, less frozen. But the silence clung to the trunks like mist, the same silence Isabel had heard the morning she found them. And as they neared the bend where the creek curved, her breath caught. There it was, the tree, the rock, the soft hollow where a patch of quilt had once sat, crumpled beneath the boughs. Raya stopped, and for the first time since they'd left the cottage, her tail drooped. She walked to the exact spot where the box had been, where she'd huddled with her pups under the weight of frost and fear, and sat. Not laid down, just sat. Still, watching, waiting. Isabel stood behind her, arms crossed against the chill. Her eyes moved across the clearing, taking in the familiarity of it all. But something had changed, not in the landscape, but in Raya's body. She wasn't guarding now. She wasn't afraid. She was remembering. And more than that, she was grieving. It hit Isabel like a wave. Raya hadn't come back here to search for danger. She'd come to say goodbye to the version of herself that had lived in the snow, to the fear she had wrapped around her pups like armor, to the abandonment that still echoed through the branches like a ghost. "Oh, sweetheart," Isabel whispered, stepping forward. Raya didn't flinch when she knelt beside her, didn't move when Isabel's fingers brushed her back. They stayed like that woman and dog, past and present beneath the brittle light of morning, until the wind quieted, until Raya finally stood. She turned once, looked at the hollow again, and then, for the first time since the walk began, walked toward Isabel. Not ahead of her, not away from her, with her. By the time they reached the cottage again, the pups were yapping at the window, tails a blur of curiosity and impatience. Isabel laughed through a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She opened the door, and the warmth rushed to meet them like an old friend. Raya hesitated for half a second, then stepped inside, and didn't look back. The morning was colder than expected. A heavy silence had blanketed the woods, not the kind that comforted, but the kind that remembered. Isabel could feel it the moment she stepped beyond the threshold of her cottage, the air brittle, the wind hesitant. The trees stood still today, as though listening. Raya trotted ahead, her paws brushing through frost-kissed leaves, tail held low and stiff. She didn't look back this time. She didn't need to. Isabel was already following, drawn by the same pull neither of them could quite explain. The old path greeted them again, winding beneath bare-limbed birches and past moss-darkened stones. Isabel had walked this trail dozens of times in her years here, but ever since that morning with the box under the tree, the land had shifted. It no longer belonged to leisure. It belonged to memory. And memory, she knew, had claws. They reached the creek by mid-morning. There was no sound but the subtle gurgle of water pressing under thin sheets of ice. The current had slowed, as if even it were reluctant to move on. The clearing looked just as it had that day. Same ancient pine branches hunched over the hollow. Same jagged rock like a crooked tombstone beside the tree line. The snow was thinner now, revealing patches of earth, of tangled root and withered grass, a graveyard of what had been. The quilt Isabel had wrapped the pups in was no longer there, of course, but the imprint of it remained, invisible yet heavy. Raya slowed as they stepped into the clearing. Her ears perked, and a faint whine slipped from her throat, more breath than sound. She moved carefully, each pawfall deliberate. She sniffed the air, then the ground, then the tree bark, and she whimpered, not out of fear, out of memory. Isabel watched her, heart caught somewhere between ache and awe. Raya moved to the exact spot where the box had been a small indentation in the soil, now laced with pine needles and old ice. She pawed at it once, then stepped back and stood still. Her tail didn't wag. Her body didn't settle. She just watched. The trees, the sky, the shadow of the rock. And Isabel knew. She was searching not for danger, but for the moment that had defined her. The moment someone had left her behind. Isabel stepped closer, her boots crunching softly. Her fingers brushed the frayed edge of her coat pocket, where she always kept a corner of that very same patchwork quilt, now a reminder to herself that the past could be carried gently. "It's all right," she said, voice barely louder than the creek's whisper. "No one's coming to take you away again." Raya didn't move, but her ear twitched at the sound. "I know what this place is to you." The words caught in her throat, because it wasn't just Raya's place of pain. It was theirs. Isabel remembered the box, the frost that had rimed its edges, the way the pups had huddled blind, barely breathing, how Raya had wrapped herself around them like a final prayer, her body stiff with resolve and resignation. She remembered the look in those golden eyes when she first approached not just fear, but betrayal, as though the world had tried to end her and she dared to survive anyway. And now, here she stood again, not as prey, not as a mother barely clinging to life, but as a being reclaiming the moment that tried to break her. There was something sacred in that. Raya took a few steps forward and pressed her nose into the hollow earth. Then she lifted her head and howled. It wasn't long, it wasn't loud, but it was raw, sharp enough to pierce the brittle cold and hang in the branches like smoke. Isabel's eyes welled. It was grief, but not helplessness. It was goodbye. She sank to one knee beside the shepherd, careful not to touch her just yet. Instead, she let the silence swell between them, that deep, respectful space that forms when someone lays down a piece of themselves in front of you. "You were waiting for someone who never came back," Isabel whispered. "And maybe I was too." The wind stirred. It carried the scent of pine, of damp bark, and old time. A squirrel darted across the upper branches, but neither of them flinched. After a while, Raya turned her head and looked at Isabel. Her eyes weren't wide anymore. They were soft, tired but open. She stepped forward and rested her head against Isabel's side. And this time, this one moment, she was the one to offer comfort. The walk back was slow, not because of weariness, but because neither of them wanted to leave too fast. The trail behind them no longer felt like an escape from pain. It felt like a ribbon tying past and present. It felt like a scar, healed but visible, a reminder. As they approached the cottage, Isabel looked once more over her shoulder. The trees were still, but somehow they felt lighter now. Not empty, just at peace. The sound of brittle twigs cracking underfoot gave Isabel pause. They had just rounded the bend past the hollow pine when Raya halted, body going rigid. Her ears perked, nose lifted slightly into the cold air. Then low and raw growl rolled from deep in her chest. Isabel instinctively placed a hand on the dog's back. It wasn't an aggressive growl. It was laced with something else. Uncertainty, memory. Then she saw him. Slouched on a fallen log near the creek's edge sat a man thin, unshaven, a coat far too big hanging off bony shoulders. His head hung low, as if it weighed more than the rest of his body combined. One hand dangled a nearly empty glass bottle, the label long faded. The other rubbed absent-mindedly at his temples. He looked like a shadow that had forgotten how to stand up. Raya's growl quieted. She took a step forward, tail stiff, not wagging but not tucked either. Her golden eyes locked on the man as though watching a dream from too long ago. Isabel narrowed her eyes, heart thudding. She didn't know this man, not really, but there was something hollow about him that tugged at her gut. Something familiar in the kind of ache he carried. Raya barked once. Not sharp, not territorial, more questioning. The man startled. He looked up slowly, like someone waking from an old nightmare. His eyes were bloodshot, skin drawn tight over high cheekbones. His lips cracked, dusted with frost. For a moment he just stared at the dog. Then he whispered, "Raya?" It wasn't a question. It was a wound reopening. Raya didn't move. She didn't charge or cower. She just stood there, head tilted slightly, breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. And Isabel watched Hart, caught between suspicion and sorrow, as something unreadable flickered in the shepherd's posture. Like she recognized the voice but couldn't place the soul behind it. The man dropped the bottle, and it rolled into the roots of a nearby tree. His shoulders sagged, and he let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, more like an exhale broken into pieces. "I thought you were dead," he murmured. I thought they'd all died." Isabel stepped forward cautiously, placing herself between him and Raya. "Who are you?" she asked, voice steady but not unkind. He looked at her, then really looked, and for a second, he seemed to shrink, like he expected her judgment to be a fist. I'm Miles," he said. "Raya's, or I washer owner. Her handler, really. For the program." He tried to straighten, failed, then buried his face in his hands. "I come here every week, just in case." Silence stretched between them, thick as the gray clouds overhead. Raya took another step. Then another. Isabel watched as the dog cautiously approached the man on the log, slow, measured, every muscle tight. She stopped a few feet from him, ears twitching. The man looked up again, his breath catching. "I didn't leave her," he whispered hoarsely. "God help me, I didn't. That transport, it flipped. Smoke, fire, screaming, then silence. I crawled out, but I couldn't find her. I thought she ran. I tried to go back. They told me no, that she was gone." His voice cracked on the last word. He looked like a man whose guilt had made a home in his ribcage and carved its initials there. Raya sat down. Not close, but not far either. And that simple, act quiet, deliberate made something in Isabel's chest collapse. Because Raya hadn't turned her back. She hadn't growled again. She was listening. And sometimes that's all grief needs in order to breathe. Miles wiped at his face with shaking hands. "I searched for months. Then they told me she was classified. No grave, no closure, just moved on. But I couldn't." He looked at Isabel, and for the first time, there was no shame in his face. Only pleading. "I didn't leave her. I loved that dog. She was all I had after the army spit me out. After the court ruled me unfit to see my daughter. Raya, she was my anchor." He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled photo. It was old, faded, but Isabel could still make out the shape of a younger, sturdier Miles crouching beside a bright-eyed German shepherd. Raya. Before the scars, before the snow. "I thought I saw ghosts when I heard her bark," Miles said quietly. "I've been dreaming of that sound for years. Hearing it for real, it tore something open." Isabel finally stepped aside. She didn't say she forgave him, it wasn't her place. But she didn't walk away either. Instead, she sat down on the other end of the log. "You've been coming here all this time?" she asked. "Every week," he replied. "Even when it snowed. Even when I had no place else to be." Raya moved again, closing the space between them by another foot. Then, slowly, carefully, she lowered her head, not quite a gesture of affection, but not distrust either. She was remembering, and Isabel knew what she had to do. "Come with us," she said softly. Miles looked at her like she'd offered him the sun. "You don't have to stay here, frozen in time." He blinked. "I don't think I deserve that." "No one does," Isabel replied. "But sometimes, mercy shows up anyway, wrapped in fur, limping but alive." Behind them, the creek gurgled quietly, a lullaby for second chances. And beside her, for the first time, Raya wagged her tail, just once. But it was enough. They walked back in silence. Snow crunched under their feet, a rhythm soft and steady. But something inside Miles was unraveling, with each step threads of guilt finally too frayed to hold. Raya stayed close to Isabel, occasionally glancing back, ears half-pinned, as if unsure what to make of the man behind them. He hadn't said a word since the creek. But at Isabel's doorstep, he stopped and broke. "I didn't want to be this," Miles choked out. "I didn't mean to become whatever I am now." Isabel didn't answer right away. She stood at the threshold, hand on the doorknob, wind tugging at her coat. Raya leaned slightly against her hip, warm and quiet. Inside, the fire still glowed from the morning's embers. "Then say what you need to say," she said without turning. Inside, Miles sat at the kitchen table, eyes bloodshot, shoulders slumped. His hands shook as he wrapped them around a mug of tea Isabel had placed in front of him, not out of sympathy, but decency. She remained standing, arms crossed. Raya lay on the rug nearby, head between her paws, but eyes tracking Miles like a memory that hadn't made up its mind. He didn't meet her gaze. Any of them. Instead, his voice cracked open, low and raw. "She wasn't supposed to be on that truck," he said. That transport Raya was already being evaluated for retirement. She was limping, had just had pups. They weren't sure if they'd survived. His throat worked against the words. "But I wasn't ready to let her go. I said she could handle it. Told them she was tough. That I'd vouch for her. And they believed me. Hell, I believed me." He swallowed hard. "When the blast hit, everything flipped. I remember screaming her name. The flames. The metal. I tried to get back in." He glanced toward Raya, then quickly away. "I tried, but they held me down. Said the wreck was unstable. That no one else was alive in there." Miles buried his face in his hands. "I let them walk me away from her. I didn't fight hard enough. I should have stayed." Isabel's voice was cool, but not cruel. And then he exhaled like something inside him collapsed. "I unraveled," he whispered. "I left the Corps, drifted. I couldn't sleep, couldn't hold a job. Every street corner had a dog that looked like her. Every alley felt like penance." A bitter laugh. "You ever try to drink yourself into forgetting the one creature that never gave up on you?" He didn't wait for an answer. "I tried everything. Rehab, therapy, even sent letters to the unit. No one answered. I convinced myself she was dead. It was easier than believing I'd abandoned her." The room was still. Isabel finally moved, setting her tea down with a soft clink. "You didn't just abandon her," she said. "You let yourself disappear too." Miles flinched. "I know," he said. "That's the worst part. I didn't just fail her. I failed everyone. My ex, my daughter, myself. I became the story I swore I'd never be." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You want to hate me? Get in line." There was a long silence. Then Isabel walked over and sat across from him. She didn't soften, not entirely, but her voice gentled, like a blade turned sideways. "I don't hate you," she said, "but I am angry." Miles blinked, surprised. "Not just at what you did or didn't do, but at how you let shame become a prison." Raya survived. She limped through a storm with open wounds and carried new life in her belly. "And you? You sat on a log every week drinking ghosts." He looked away, ashamed. "But," she continued, voice steadier, "I've also seen men carry grief like bricks in their pockets, afraid to lay them down because they think they're part of who they are now." She leaned forward slightly. "You want to make it right?" she asked. "Start with yourself." Miles looked up. "What does that mean?" "Stop running," she said. "Get clean, write your daughter. Apologize even if she doesn't answer. Feed Raya by hand if you have to. Earn it. Don't expect a quick fix, just show up." She pointed gently toward the sleeping shepherd. She showed up. The words hit something deep. Miles nodded slowly. He looked to Raya again. She was watching now, head tilted slightly, not judgmental, just present. As if she too was waiting to see who he would choose to become. Outside, the wind howled across the snowy hills. But inside, something thawed. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor as the day began its slow exhale into dusk. Isabel stood by the sink, her hands cradling a cup of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. She hadn't taken a sip in the past hour. Across the room, Miles sat hunched in the armchair, like a man who had stepped into someone else's life and wasn't sure he had permission to stay. His clothes still smelled faintly of creek water and old regret. His boots sat by the door, dripping onto the mat, forgotten. Raya lay on the rug. Not asleep, but not alert, that soft in-between where trust was still negotiating with memory. He told his story. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough that silence had settled between them. No longer suffocating, just true. Isabel set her tea down and walked over to the side table. She picked up a notepad, the kind with uneven pages and a corner bent from years of use. She tore a sheet cleanly and sat across from him at the small table, reaching for a pen. She didn't speak as she wrote. The scratching of ink was the only sound in the room, and even that seemed to hesitate, as if each letter carried more weight than it should. When she was done, she slid the paper across to him. An address, a phone number, and beneath it, in careful handwriting, Granite Hollow Shelter and Recovery Center. Ask for Isabel. We'll be here, if you're ready. Miles stared at it like it was a foreign script. His fingers didn't move right away. His eyes scanned the page over and over again, as though memorizing the shape of each letter might somehow make the road back easier. When he finally reached for it, his hands trembled. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. "Why would you even give me this?" Isabel exhaled. "Because I believe in second chances," she said. "Not blindly, not easily, but because I've needed them myself." She didn't elaborate, didn't need to. Raya stirred slightly, shifting her weight with a soft sigh, the kind of sound that seemed to bridge worlds. Miles folded the paper carefully, precisely, like it was a document too sacred to crumple. He tucked it into his jacket pocket over his heart. It was a small thing, but Isabel saw the gesture for what it was: reverence, desperation, hope. He looked up again, and his eyes, though rimmed red, were steadier now. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. She nodded. "Most people aren't." A pause. Then, with gentle firmness, "But readiness isn't a feeling. It's a decision." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Isabel added, "I'm not offering pity, and I'm not saying it'll be easy, but there's something worth fighting for here if you're willing." She gestured slightly toward Raya, who was now watching Miles with an unreadable expression. "She came through hell to survive. You can too, but only if you meet her where she is." Miles glanced at the shepherd, and something flickered across his face, a silent reckoning, raw and uneven. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the start of mercy. For himself. He stood slowly, like his body had forgotten the motion. "I'll try," he said. Isabel tilted her head. "Number, don't try," he blinked. "Do," she said. "Or don't. Just don't lie to yourself in the middle." There was no anger in her tone, just a history of learning the hard way. Miles gave a soft, bitter laugh, but he nodded. He walked to the door and paused. His eyes roamed the small cabin one last time, the patched quilt near the fire, the empty food bowls in the corner, the worn collar hanging on the hook by the door. "Thank you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Isabel didn't reply, just gave a single, small nod. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in. The snow had started again, light flakes swirling like ash from a sky too tired to scream. As he stepped out, Isabel said one final thing. "When you're ready to do the work, come find us." He paused on the porch, letting the words land. Miles stood there for a beat too long, the paper still pressed to his chest beneath his coat, as though he were afraid it might slip away if he let go. Then he walked down the steps. The crunch of his boots in the snow faded into the wind. Inside, Isabel turned and sat back down by the fire. Raya came over quietly, resting her chin on Isabel's knee. Her body was warm, solid, alive. Together they watched the flames return to life. Not because someone stirred them, but because, sometimes, even embers remember how to burn again. The snow had softened since they'd arrived, no longer the biting kind that cuts through layers, but gentler, almost mournful in how it fell. The creek behind them whispered beneath a gauze of ice, muffled by time and memory. Isabel zipped up her coat slowly, her fingers brushing against the zipper like she was stalling, not for her sake, but his. She didn't speak, neither did Raya. But silence no longer meant nothing. It meant weight. It meant things unsaid, felt. Raya stood up beside her, giving her body a long stretch before padding to the edge of the clearing. Her ears twitched at the forest's breath. Her tail hung low, uncertain. Isabel adjusted her scarf. "Come on, girl," she murmured gently. The shepherd hesitated just for a second, then followed. Behind them, on the half-rotted log, Miles remained seated, his elbows resting on his knees, hands slack between them. The paper with Isabel's handwriting was tucked safely in his coat pocket, but it felt heavier than before, like it held not just ink and intention, but the entire weight of choice. Raya paused at the tree line. She turned. The faintest breeze rustled her fur as she looked back directly at him. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even forgiving. It just was. A gaze that asked, "Are you still the man we left behind? Or the one who might still come home?" Miles didn't breathe. Raya blinked, then turned away and vanished into the trees behind Isabel. He didn't move. Not yet. Couldn't. He watched until the last shift of Isabel's coat disappeared behind the thick boughs of pine, until the only trace they'd ever been there were the paw prints slowly filling with snow. The wind made the trees groan gently, old and tired like him. He pulled the note from his pocket, just to be sure it was still real. He stared at the words again, the looping I in Isabel's name, the steady weight of the address, like a compass waiting to be followed. He could hear her voice in his head still. "When you're ready to do the work, come find us." He folded the paper once more, this time tighter, as if hoping it would compress the ache in his chest along with it. For a long while, Miles stayed seated. A hawk screeched somewhere above the tree line, and then, like something small and cracked opening, his voice came not out loud, but deep within, murmured like a prayer that didn't yet know its God. "There's still a way." He looked down at his hands, dirt under the nails, calloused palms. They used to build things, fix things, cradle small puppies like they were the last good thing he could hold. Maybe. The word barely formed in his throat, but it hovered there. Meanwhile, Isabel walked in rhythm with the forest boots crunching softly, the hush of snowfall huddling around her like a shawl. Raya trotted beside her, not quite touching but never straying far. Every few yards, she'd glance sideways, as if checking that Isabel was still there, that the space between them hadn't changed. At one point, Isabel spoke to no one in particular, or maybe to herself. "I don't know what he'll do." Raya didn't respond, but her ears flicked, acknowledging. "I don't know if I'd want to, if I were him." They walked on. "But I think," Isabel added quietly, "everyone deserves a map, even if they're too scared to read it right away." Raya bumped her nose gently into Isabel's leg. No bark, no demand, just contact. And then they kept going. Back at the clearing, Miles finally rose. The log creaked in protest beneath him, the chill clinging to the back of his knees. He stood fully, facing the trees, facing the place they'd vanished. He raised a hand toward the note again, instinct, but stopped. Let it stay where it was, safe over his heart. Instead, he looked forward and whispered, like a man who didn't yet believe the words he said, but needed to try them on, "I'm not done." The forest said nothing, but the path in front of him remained. The bell above the shelter door gave a tinny jingle too cheerful for how Miles felt walking in. His boots tracked faint mud over the welcome mat that had long since stopped trying to look welcoming. The foyer smelled of antiseptic, damp fur, and something warm and faintly sweet. Oatmeal, maybe? Or hope? The paint on the walls had peeled in places soft blue curls, revealing older layers of beige and green beneath. A laminated poster about flea treatments was peeling at the edges. Beside it, a hand-painted sign read, "Every creature deserves a second chance." He stood just inside the doorway for a few moments, not moving, just breathing. The warmth hit him harder than expected, not just the heat in the room, but the feeling of being inside, of people caring what happened past this door. He almost turned back. Then a voice called out, "You just going to stand there looking like a lost coyote, or you need something?" Miles blinked. From a side hallway, a woman appeared, short, sturdy, early 60s, with iron gray curls pulled into a tight bun. Her flannel sleeves were rolled up, and her hands were gloved in blue latex, one still holding a syringe mid-task. "Might want to close that door before a cat makes a break for it," she added, nodding at the entrance behind him. Miles shuffled back and pulled the door shut with a soft click. The woman didn't smile, but her gaze wasn't unkind. "Margaret," she said, stripping off her gloves and extending a hand. "I run this circus." "Miles," he murmured, gripping her hand with the hesitation of someone who hadn't shaken many lately. She studied him, not rudely. Just a look that said she'd seen worse and better, and that she was trying to figure out which category he might fall into. "You're the one Isabel mentioned?" He nodded once. Margaret motioned him toward a worn bench near the front desk. A bowl of peppermints sat untouched beside a jar labeled "Donations for Dental Care." A nearby Labrador in a kennel thumped its tail lazily. "She told me you might stop by," Margaret said, pulling out a chair across from him. "Didn't say when. Didn't say how ready you'd be." Miles glanced around, the hum of fluorescent lights above, the gentle shuffle of paws behind closed kennel doors, the occasional bark from deeper within. I don't really know where to start." "Oh." Margaret leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "Then let's not start with words. Let's start with truth." Miles looked down at his hands. They were dry, cracked. He rubbed the dirt from under one fingernail with his thumb, stalling. Isabel, she gave me your address," he finally said. "Said if I wanted to do something right, this was the place." Margaret's voice softened just a notch. "She said you had something to make right. That true?" He swallowed. "I abandoned them," he said. The words fell flat. Not dramatic, just true. "I left a dog in her litter near the creek. I thought I'd come back, but I didn't. Not until—" His voice cracked. He didn't finish the sentence. Margaret nodded once, slowly. "So, why now?" He couldn't answer right away. His voice got stuck between guilt and frostbite. "Because I saw her," he said. "Raya. And she didn't bite me. She didn't turn away. She just looked, like she remembered me. And she still waited." His hands trembled, resting on his thighs. "And Isabel didn't scream. She just saw me, like I was still human somehow." Margaret said nothing at first, then stood, walked to the desk, and pulled out a folder. "This isn't a confessional," she said. "We're not a place where you come, say sorry, and leave lighter. This is a place where you stay, where you mop vomit, scrape out litter boxes, feed creatures that hiss at you, and little by little, you stop making it about you." She handed him the folder. Inside was a simple volunteer form. Name, emergency contact, history with animals, days available. "I'm not asking you to become a saint," Margaret said, "but if you want to earn back what you broke, it begins with showing up." Miles stared at the form like it was a sacred text, then looked up. "I'm not sober yet," he admitted. "Some mornings I still wake up shaking." Margaret nodded. "Then we start there too." In the silence that followed, the Labrador behind the gate let out a soft, hopeful whine. Margaret stood. "Come back tomorrow, 10 sharp. No drinking before. No excuses. First shift's kennel cleanup. Not glamorous, but it's where we all start." Miles stood, gripping the folder like it might blow away. "You think I'm worth it?" he asked, not even sure why the words left his mouth. Margaret gave him a long look. "I think they are," she said, nodding toward the kennels. "And if you're here for them, you might just find there's something in it for you, too." The next 3 weeks folded over one another like dog-eared pages in a book Miles hadn't planned on finishing. It began with the smell of bleach and kibble dust. At 6 in the morning, Margaret pressed a mop handle into his palm before sunrise, pointed toward the kennels, and left him to learn the rhythm of rinsing concrete and murmuring reassurance to trembling terriers. By 8, he was hauling 50-pound feed bags, sweat carving clean lines through the grime on his cheeks. Each day ended with the same cold wind on his walk back to the shelter's dormitory wing, a converted storage room that rattled when trucks sped past on the highway. Tucked against his heart, the folded paper with Isabel's looping handwriting stayed in the inside pocket of his jacket. He checked for it the way a soldier checks a weapon, fingertips brushing the crinkled edge whenever doubt crept up his spine. Nights were hardest. Sleep came in fractured reels. Raya bounding toward him, tail a metronome of forgiven joy, then snapping to the moment beneath the overturned transport. Her whimpers swallowed by fire. He would jolt upright on the dormitory cot, sweat damp, reaching for a dog that wasn't there, whispering, "Easy girl," to the darkness. Margaret's routine left little space for self-pity. After kennel duty, she marched him to the multi-purpose room, fluorescence buzzing, a circle of plastic chairs waiting, like open mouths. Group therapy at 10 o'clock sharp. Veterans, ex-cons, one teenage addict with eyes too old for 15, a volunteer counselor named Doctor, Lewis guided them through the wreckage of choices, voice exercises for panic, grounding drills for flashbacks. Miles listened more than he spoke, but on the fifth session his voice finally cracked free. "I ran," he admitted, staring at the scuffed linoleum. "And every mile after that felt like punishment I chose. No one clapped. No one scolded. They just nodded and unspoken. We've been there before, moving on to someone else's confession." Afternoons smelled of printer toner and bitter coffee. Job readiness workshop. A gray-haired volunteer named Pete slid a blank resume template across the table and told Miles to fill the silence with facts, not failures. Together they translated military K-9 handler into bullets that sounded employable, team leadership under crisis conditions, explosives, detection expertise, training program development. Pete even coaxed a laugh out of him when they reached the section labeled objective. "How about to stop hiding from potential?" Miles managed a crooked grin. They settled on something safer, but the idea lodged in his ribs. Evenings, Margaret paired him with a lanky college intern named Julio for computer training in the cramped admin office. Spreadsheets, email etiquette, job search portals. Miles's fingers felt clumsy on the keyboard, but each saved document was a brick in a bridge he'd once burned behind him. Julio teased him good-naturedly. "Don't worry, man. Even grandmas know copy-paste now." And Miles found he didn't mind. Laughter sounded foreign, but not unwelcome. Through it all, the note remained his talisman. On laundry day, he'd remove the jacket and unfold the paper, smoothing the creases as if they were fractures in bone. "We'll be here." 4 words that carried the weight of a life raft. He rewrote the address on the inside cover of a battered notebook, afraid the ink might one day blur, but the original stayed close to his chest where the pulse could remind him it was real. Some nights, after lights out, he added secret rituals. 5 push-ups for every puppy he'd abandoned. 45 total, to etch apology into muscle. 10 mindful breaths, thinking of Raya's steady gaze, to anchor his mind when it drifted toward the bottle. Margaret noticed the change. Fewer tremors in the morning, clearer eyes during chores. She said nothing, simply slid him an extra cafeteria cookie on Thursday and walked away. Midway through the 3rd week, Dr. Lewis pulled him aside after group. "You're carrying progress and guilt in the same pocket," she said. "They'll rip each other to shreds if you don't separate them," he answered by tapping the folded note. "This is the seam," he murmured. She didn't push further. On Friday, Margaret pinned a flyer to the corkboard. The County Transit Authority was hiring maintenance apprentices, full benefits, mentorship, no degree required. Miles copied the application link onto a sticky note. Julio helped him craft the cover letter. Pete tweaked the resume again. And on Sunday hands, only mildly shaking, Miles clicked send. That night, the dream returned, but different. Raya was still running toward him. Only now the pups spilled around her feet like tumbling marbles, yipping. Unafraid, Miles knelt, arms open, and she reached him. Before he woke, he felt the thud of her weight against his chest, the warmth impossible, undeniable. He sat up in the dormitory cot, dawn barely bleeding into the sky. For the first time in years, his first conscious thought wasn't a tally of failures. It was a question, quiet but firm. What comes next? He pressed a palm over his jacket pocket. The note crinkled, a soft reminder. There was still a way, and he was already walking it. The rain had settled into a steady patter on the shelter's metal roof, loud enough that each drop felt like a knock on the heart. Monday night meant circle time 12 chairs in a loose ring beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like restless thoughts. Miles sat in the seat farthest from the door, fingertips pressed together, the folded resume in his pocket feeling suddenly flimsy against the heaviness in his chest. Dr. Lewis opened with her gentle baritone, a breathing exercise. A reminder that nothing said within these cinder block walls would leave them without permission. The man beside Melissa, former mechanic named Darius, spoke first, recounting how he'd skipped his sponsors' calls and spent 3 hours outside a liquor store before turning away. Applause rippled, soft and sincere. Next came Lena, the teen with old eyes, describing the numb terror of her court date that morning. Someone offered a tissue. She took it without shame. When the silence swung toward Miles, he tried to dodge its gaze, picking at an invisible thread on his sleeve. But Dr. Lewis's calm invitation found him anyway. "Miles, how was today?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. A bead of rain hammered the roof like a gavel. He swallowed, tasting rust and fear. "I rewrote my cover letter," he began, voice thin. Julio said it sounded credible. A few nods, encouragement. "But that's not what kept me up last night." The room leaned in it with curiosity, but with patient gravity. Miles clasped his hands so tightly his knuckles blanched. "I've told you about Raya," he said, gaze fixed on the floor tiles. "What I haven't said is, she wasn't the only one I left." The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder as he inhaled. "I left my family," he whispered, but the whisper grew until it echoed off the painted cinder walls. "I left my wife and my little girl. I signed the divorce papers from a VA clinic and never showed up to mediation. I missed her 8th birthday, then her 9th. 2 weeks ago, she turned 11. His voice cracked on the number. It sounded too big and too small at once. "I didn't call. I couldn't face the question I knew she'd ask. 'Daddy, why didn't you come home?'" The sentence crumpled him. Shoulders shook. His breath hitched. Ragged, like tires on gravel. For a heartbeat, he was sure he'd ruined the fragile respect he'd earned here, that everyone would recoil from the stench of failure leaking out of him. No one moved away. Lena reached across the circle and set a single square of folded tissue on his knee. She didn't force it into his hand. She just let it be there if he needed it. Darius gave a slow nod as if to say, "We break things we love when we're broken ourselves." On Dr. Lewis's clipboard, the pen stopped moving. Silence bloomed, but it wasn't empty. Was a held breath of communal witnessing. Miles pressed the tissue to his eyes. "I used to think guilt was punishment enough," he said, voice hoarse. "Turns out it's just heavy, not useful. I kept waiting for the courage to fix everything to show up first. But courage doesn't come just time slipping away." He lifted his head. In the polished glass of the office window, he caught his reflection. Cheeks hollow yet reddened. Rain. Muddied hair. Eyes swollen but clear. A man half drowned, still gasping, but alive. He met his own gaze and found no monster staring back, only a man terrified of the distance between who he had been and who he was trying to become. "Tomorrow," he whispered, but everyone heard him. "I call her." The word tomorrow felt frail, so he said it again, stronger. "Tomorrow I call my daughter." No applause followed, only a collective exhale, as though every chest in the room deflated with relief for him. "Doctor." Lewis offered a gentle, "Would you like support drafting what you want to say?" Miles nodded, unable to speak. Darius touched 2 fingers to his own chest, a silent pledge to stand beside him if the words got stuck. The rain eased to a hush. Someone shut off the humming lights, leaving the room dim except for the hallway glow and the softness of shared resolve. Miles realized he was still holding the tissue. He folded it small and slipped it into his pocket beside Isabel's note. 2 scraps of paperone, a map to a future, the other a reminder of the cost of silence. Together, they felt like the heaviest and most necessary things he owned. When the circle dissolved and chairs scraped gently across the floor, no one hurried out. People lingered, trading shy half-smiles. The kind of connection born from scars shone without flinching. Miles stayed the longest, wiping tables, stacking chairs, grounding himself in the mundane. Before he left, Dr. Lewis stopped him at the door. "You know the phone might ring once, twice, or not at all," she cautioned. "I know," he said. Then, with a breath that tasted like possibility, "Doesn't change the dialing." Outside, the rain had quit entirely, leaving puddles that reflected the streetlights like shards of warm glass. He tugged his jacket tighter, the folded note crinkling over his heart. For the first time since the crash, the night felt less like a punishment and more like an open road. Tomorrow would arrive with or without his courage, but he intended to meet it ringing. He started the walk back to the dormitory, head bowed against the chill, and found the wind smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke, the way Raya's fur had on those dawn patrols years ago. In that scent he heard her bark, sometimes wagging, sometimes crying, and let it guide him forward, one step closer to the call he would make at sunrise. The gravel drive to Isabel's cottage felt shorter than Miles remembered, though he suspected it was his heartbeat that had quickened the distance, not the road itself. Evening light trembled low behind the tree line, washing the snowmelt in copper and rose. He cut the engine of the borrowed shelter van and sat for a breath, hands resting on the steering wheel, clean nails, no tremor. The folded resume in his coat pocket now shared space with a printout of his daughter's first reply. A single sentence, "Hi, Dad, tiny, colossal." He exhaled, opened the door, and the cold rushed in with a smell of damp earth and thawing pine. Boots crunching, he followed the familiar flagstones to the porch. The boards remembered his weight and groaned in recognition. He raised a hand to knock, hesitated, then noticed his reflection in the window. Hair trimmed, stubble neat, shoulders squared by weeks of labor, and a promise harder than muscle. He knocked twice, soft. A heartbeat later, a bark erupted from inside sharp, commanding, impossibly known. Raya. The sound cracked open a pocket of warmth under his ribs, equal parts joy and fear. He heard her nails skitter on wood, a quick scrape against the door. Then another bark shorter, questioning. Miles rubbed his palms on his thighs, whispered, "Easy, girl," though she couldn't yet hear him. The lock clicked. The door eased open, stopping at the breadth of a chain. Isabel's face appeared in the glow of firelight older than his memory, or maybe just more certain. Her eyes traveled from his boots to his eyes, searching for the man she'd last seen fractured on a creek bank. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, voice steady but softer than the night air. Miles's smile felt like breaking fresh crust on snow small, crackling, real. "Neither was I," he admitted. Isabel studied him a breath longer, then closed the door just enough to unhook the chain. When it swung wide, warm cedar heat spilled onto the porch. Raya tucked herself beside Isabel's legs, still barking in low bursts, tail a metronome of conflict, caution, and hope dueling in every swipe. Miles knelt, letting his knees thud the porch planks. "Hey, partner," he murmured. His throat tightened around the word. No other would do. Raya froze, ears pricked so sharply he thought they might tear. One step, then another slow, deliberate. Her nose found his palm first. She inhaled, deep and quivering, sifted through smells of bleach, shelter dogs, cheap laundry soap, something in her body uncoiled. The bark dissolved into a high whine that shattered his composure. Tears blurred the edges of her shape until she nudged his chin with her muzzle. He bowed his head into her neck, inhaled fur that still carried a ghost of creek water and quilt threads. When he whispered, "Good girl," his voice shook, but his hands stayed steady. Isabel watched from the doorway, arms folded loosely, a smile fighting its way through caution. "You look different," she said when Miles rose. "Been scrubbing kennels," he answered, stepping inside as she moved back. The living room sparked an avalanche of scent, memories, wood stove, smoke, puppy breath, wool blanket warmed by fire. The pups larger now, ears half upright tumbled from behind the couch like living exclamation points. Luna led the charge, Tank close behind, while Scout and Pip hovered shyly near the hearth. Miles crouched again, laughter slipping free as Tank barreled into his shin. "Hope you don't mind the welcome committee," Isabel said, closing the door. "I've missed worse meetings." He scratched Luna between the ears. "They've grown. They eat as much as a platoon," Isabel replied, then motioned toward the kitchen. "Tea? Unless you're off caffeine for those jitters." Miles followed, unzipping his coat. "Shakes are gone. Margaret's got me on more productive addictions now, like spreadsheets." Isabel arched a brow while filling the kettle. "So you've been showing up?" "Every day, even on the ones I didn't want to." He pulled the folded piece of paper from his pocket, the invitation she'd written weeks ago, edges worn soft. "Kept this close. Turns out maps work when you actually walk." She set 2 mugs on the counter. "And your family?" He drew a breath. "Spoke to my daughter last night. She laughed at one of my bad jokes, so..." First miracle logged. "Miracles add up," Isabel said. She lifted a teapot cozy shaped like a grinning fox and slid it over the kettle as it began to whistle. "Does this visit mean you're ready for another?" Miles glanced toward the living room where Raya lay, surrounded by her brood, content but watchful. "I came to ask permission to keep earning it," he said. "I have a job interview next week. If it lands, I'll need a place somewhere near enough to visit to help, but not in your way." Isabel sighed, half laugh, half release. "You're already underfoot, and the floor hasn't collapsed yet." Hope rushed through him like too hot tea. "That a yes?" "It's a try," she corrected gently. Same deal I gave, the pups no guarantees. Daily feeding of trust. She slid a mug toward him. Steam curled between them, rising like a small promise. He lifted it in salute. To daily feeding. Their eyes held across the rim of the cupshares, bright with cautious pride, his shining with something that felt dangerously like belonging. From the rug, Raya thumped her tail twice. Miles inhaled the steam and let it settle in his lungs. Tomorrow's hurdles would come. The interview, the apology letters waiting to be mailed, the fragile thread with his daughter that could snap with one tremor. But tonight, he was standing in a cottage lit by fire and forgiveness, with a dog who remembered his name and a woman who'd answered the door. Outside, snowflakes stirred again, light, tentative, as though winter itself were trying one more time to start over. Tank spotted Miles first. The stout pup barreled across the living room rug like a miniature freight train, paws slipping on the wood floor before colliding with Miles's boot. The others followed Scout with his confident trot, Luna gliding behind like sleek velvet, Pip bringing up the rear in a series of clumsy hops. They swarmed Miles's ankles, squeaking, sniffing, nipping playfully at his laces as if greeting a long-lost littermate rather than the man who once left them to the night. Miles laughed sharp, surprised then crouched to gather the tumbling bodies. The weeks of kennel scrubbing had toughened his hands, but they shook now under a tremor he couldn't blame on withdrawal. He scooped Pip into his palms, feeling the delicate flutter of a tiny heartbeat against his thumbs. The pup's milky eyes studied him with that trusting blankness only the very young possess. Something within him fractured in the best and worst way. Across the room, Raya stood motionless beside the hearth, half lit by firelight. Her ears flicked forward and back, as if each rapid movement were a question demanding its own answer. She did not bark this time, nor did she pace. She simply watched while her brood clambered over the newcomer's knees. Her tail hovered, uncertain, like a metronome waiting for direction. Miles lowered Pip gently and sat cross-legged, letting Tank climb a makeshift mountain up his thigh. "Easy, soldier," he whispered, smoothing the pup's hindquarters before it toppled backward with a yip. He sensed Raya's gaze even when he wasn't looking at her. It pressed against his nape like warm breath on a winter pane. He wanted to speak, to offer words she might understand. Contrition, gratitude, maybe both, but the language between them had never been vocabulary. It had been shared patrols, silent commands, a heartbeat matched to another through countless dawns and dangers. Isabel lingered by the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a faded tea towel. She didn't intrude, only observed, shoulders high against emotion she pretended not to feel. The fire popped and threw sparks that pirouetted in the dark above the grate, as if the room itself held its breath. Miles met Raya's eyes at last. "I missed you," he said, the sentence thin with awe, heavy with regret. The shepherd's ears rose higher, then settled halfway down. She sniffed the air, one tentative step forward, nails clicking softly against the floorboards. Another pause, another inhalation, trust measured in inches and seconds. Scout lost interest in Miles's bootstrings and trotted back to his mother, bumping her front leg with an impatient snort. Raya bent to nuzzle him aside, still protective, still mambit. Her gaze never wavered from the man on the floor. Luna planted herself between them as though staging a ceremony. The slow wag of her tiny tail seemed to plead for verdict and closure. Miles stretched his arm across the rug knot, reaching for Raya, simply opening the space between them like a gate left ajar. In his palm lay nothing but calloused skin and possibility. His breath caught. The pup's faint whimpers filled the vacuum. Raya's muscles tensed, then melted all at once. She crossed the threshold in 4 deliberate steps, each pawfall a syllable of forgiveness she had the right to withhold. She stopped so close he could see the flecks of amber in her eyes, the white hairs threaded through her muzzle where stress had aged her. A hush wrapped the cottage. Even the fire seemed to bow low. She dipped her head, whiskers brushing his fingers. Her nose touched the center of his palm, cold, then warm, as if tasting memory. Miles didn't move, afraid to spook the fragile moment. Raya inhaled again, deeper, and released a sigh that seemed to empty years of tension from her chest. Then, with the gentlest certainty, she raised her muzzle and swept her tongue across the back of his hand in slow, deliberate lick that sealed a covenant older than speech. The heat of it shot through him like sunlight knifing into an icebound creek, breaking everything soft. Miles folded, shoulders heaving. The pups startled at the sudden quake of his sob, then retreated beneath their mother's legs. He pressed both hands to his face, tears bursting hot through fingers browned by labor and repentance. The ragged sound that tore from his throat contained relief so profound it sounded like pain. Raya leaned closer, resting her chin on his knee. Her eyes tracked the tears sliding past his knuckles, and with the same careful tongue she lapped them away, each stroke a benediction. Miles's sob became a laugh, then a broken mantra. Thank you, girl. Words muffled by the wet salt of redemption. Isabel turned away, lifting the tea towel to her own face. Through blur, she watched the reflection in the windowpane man and dog knotted together on the rug, fire painting them gold. She bit down on a sob of her own, not from sadness, but from the sheer magnitude of grace taking shape before her eyes. She busied herself with the kettle, letting clinks of ceramic mask the quiver in her breath. Behind her, the pups ventured back out, paw by paw, emboldened by their mother's calm. Tank nosed Miles's elbow. Pip yipped and launched onto his lap. Luna curled against Raya's flank while Scout inspected Miles's laces again, as if testing the security of this rebuilt bridge. Miles gathered them one by one, tears still streaming, mouth curved in a trembling smile. He looked up at Isabel, eyes glazed but clear. She dabbed the corner of her own eye, then met his gaze with a nod that said, I see you, all of you. Raya's tail thumped twice against the floorboards and settled. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted past the glass, soft and slow. But inside, the last hold of winter in Miles's chest surrendered to the glow of a family imperfect, unlikely, intact. Later, the cottage settled into a hush so profound it made the ticking wall clocks sound brazen. The pups lay sprawled in a loose pile beside the hearth-tiny chests, lifting in unison, feet twitching now and then as dreams carried them over invisible fields. Raya drowsed nearby, head on her paws, one ear turned toward her sleeping brood, the other cocked to catch every human syllable. Isabel poured 2 cups of chamomile and set the battered teapot back on its trivet. She brought the mugs to the living room table, steam curling between her and Miles like a fragile bridge. He'd washed his face. The tear tracks were gone, but their memory lingered in the softness around his eyes. When he reached for the mug, his shoulders brushed a sigh that felt equal parts relief and exhaustion. Chamomile, he noted, testing the heat with a cautious sip. Haven't tasted anything this gentle in years. Gentle is underrated, Isabel said, settling into the rocker opposite him. Firelight rippled across the quilt, draped over her knees, turning every mismatched patch into a glowing ember of its own. Tell me how you've been filling your days besides kennels and resumes. Miles leaned back, letting the warmth seep into his palms. Group therapy, every morning. I hated the circle at first. Felt like sitting in a fishbowl waiting for someone to tap the glass. But somewhere around the second week, I realized no one was there to watch me drown. We're all swimming through the same murky water. A faint smile tugged his mouth. I even volunteered to share last night. Didn't stutter once. Isabel's chin dipped in quiet pride. Miles noticed Raya's tail give a lazy thump as if she, too, approved. He continued, voice steadier. The shelter director, Margaret, she promoted me to adoption interviews on Wednesdays. Says I have a knack for pairing dogs with people. I guess 10 years reading Raya's moods taught me something useful. Oh? His gaze drifted to the shepherd, and his smile faltered. But I still wake up at 4 a.m., heart racing, hearing the crash, smelling smoke. Sometimes I'm back under that flipped transport. Sometimes I'm at my daughter's 11th birthday party. Only the cake's melting and everyone's waiting for me to speak. Those nights, I walk the corridor until sunrise. He blew across the tea's surface, watching ripples chase the rim. So, progress just crooked. Isabel rocked slowly, the chair creaking like an old violin. Straight lines are overrated too, she said. You're drawing an honest map, and honest maps have switchbacks. Miles exhaled through a rueful laugh. Switchbacks? Yeah. Then softer. I mailed her another letter. My daughter. Told her I'm interviewing for a transit authority apprenticeship. Asked if she might like a visit when the snow melts. He rubbed a thumb over the mug's handle, as if polishing courage into it. Haven't heard back yet. You will, Isabel murmured. Kids take longer to trust words. They believe actions. She lifted her cup, inhaled the steam. "You've changed your actions." The fire popped. A coal collapsed inward, sending sparks whirling up the chimney throat. Miles stared into the embers, their colors shifting from orange to white to black. "Sometimes I still see that man in the creek bank with a bottle. He's in my shadow, waiting for me to trip." "Oh." Isabel's voice was gentle, but flint sharp. "You can look at your shadow without living in it." She set her mug down and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Listen to me, Miles Bennett. You're not the man who left them. Not anymore." The words landed with the weight of a vow. Miles's throat closed briefly. He tucked his chin, blinking hard. Raya lifted her head, watching him through half-lidded eyes, as if sensing a shift in atmospheric pressure. The pup slept on, unaware of the monumental sentences being exchanged feet away. Miles swallowed, voice rough. "I want to believe that. Belief grows in the doing," Isabel said. "You keep showing up for yourself, for them, for her belief will follow." She reached across the low table, resting her hand palm, up on the scarred wood. Invitation, not demand. Miles hesitated, then laid his hand over hers. The contact was light, but something ancient passed between their skinson understanding, older than guilt, deeper than regret. Outside, a gust rattled the window pane, but inside, the warmth thickened. He drew a breath that felt like stepping onto new land. "Interviews Thursday. If it sticks, I'll have evenings free. Maybe I could help here fix the porch rail, run supplies, whatever you need." Isabel squeezed his hand once before withdrawing. "We'll make a list," she said, then shot him a wry smile. "Beware. I'm ruthless with honey. Do notes." He chuckled, the sound tentative but authentic. "After Margaret, I can handle ruthless." Silence settled again, but this one was companionable, woven from steam and crackling pine. The pups shifted in their sleep. Scout let out a tiny yelp, kicking Luna in the ear. Raya rose, stepped over them, and settled beside Miles's chair, resting her head against his shin. He stroked the fur at her nape. She sighed, a sound like dusk, sliding into night without fear. Eventually, Isabel stood to stoke the fire. Miles watched her move steady, purposeful, and realized the cottage no longer smelled like nostalgia. It smelled like possibility. Wood smoke, chamomile, and the faint musk of dogs safe indoors. He finished his tea, content to let words rest. For now, trust was a quiet shepherd leaned against his leg, a patchwork quilt wrapping the room, and an old woman who believed crooked maps could still lead home. And in the soft ticking of the clock, he heard the future clear its throat, waiting for him to turn the page. Late winter eased into cautious spring, and with it came a rhythm Miles pedaling 4 gravel miles to Isabel's cottage every few days. Toolbox strapped behind him, sack of dry kibble slung over one shoulder. He'd show up before sunrise, sleeves rolled, tapping nails into weather-loosened boards as frost still clung to the grass. "You keep this up and I'll have to start charging admission," Isabel joked, handing him coffee. "Just paying my boarding fee," he grinned, nodding toward a warped fence plank. "Got any cedar?" "In the shed. Bottom shelf," she replied, then paused, glancing toward the porch. "Your shadow has company." "Lou." Raya appeared, trotting the yard's edge like a sentry, then beeline to Miles. Her tail swept figure eights as she inspected the kibble bag and leaned into his touch. Inside, chaos. The pups, no 8 weeks old, tumbled across hardwood floors, all legs and noise. Tank burst into the yard, trailed by Scout, Luna, and Pip. Miles intercepted Tank mid-charge, scooping him up before he could topple a paint can. Raya herded the rest toward the porch with gentle nudges. By mid-morning, the house buzzed with quiet purpose. Miles fixed hinges, oiled the back door, mopped sawdust. Everywhere he went, Raya followed, sometimes behind, sometimes just ahead, brushing his calf like a silent roll call. "Turns out fences are like resumes," Miles told Isabel. "You patch what's cracked, give it something to lean on." She watched him from the porch. "She follows you room to room, you know." "I noticed," he said, voice keyter now. "She trusts you. Completely." The words landed deep. Miles dropped the hammer, kneeling beside Raya. She came willingly, pressing her head into his hand. For a moment, nothing else existed but her breathing, warm and calm. Later that afternoon, Isabel returned from town to find mulch piled under the apple tree, pups snoozing in the sun, and Miles rinsing paint from his fingers at the spigot. The scent of pine resin and thawed earth filled the air. Raya bumped his knee gently, and he leaned down, forehead resting against hers. "Thank you for letting me help," he whispered. She responded with a soft chuff, tail brushing the grass. Forgiveness had matured into faith, and faith into something even stronger. On a rainy Wednesday, Isabel left Miles in charge while she fetched groceries. He accepted with mock military bravado and immediately regretted it. The pups treated the kitchen like a theme park. Mud tracked over every tile. Tank belly slid across the floor. Scout barked into an overturned pot like a war horn. Luna surveyed from a chair, while Pip zoomed in dizzy loops. Then came the runt-smallest of the litter, always shy. But today, he bounded through the door, squeaky carrot in mouth, eyes bright with joy. Miles caught him mid-leap. "You're half pint but whole heart, huh?" The pup sneezed rainwater across his chin. Miles laughed, really laughed. "Brave," he said aloud. "That's your name." The pup wagged so hard his back feet lifted. When Isabel returned, bath hour began. A galvanized tub steamed beside the hearth. The pups hesitated until Raya lapped from the water, then flopped down beside the towels, giving full permission. Scout went for swagger, gone in the face of bubbles. Luna bathed like a queen. Tank fought gloriously, soaking Miles. Pip sang protest songs. Then Brave stepped forward on his own. He climbed into the tub without prompting, chest puffed like a knight kneeling for armor. Miles burst out laughing. So did Isabel. Warmth filled the room like steam. Damp fur, popcorn scent, cedar, and laughter. Later, they spread a blanket across the floor. The pups turned it into a battlefield. Brave and Tank locked corners in a tug-of-war. Scout darted in like a rogue mercenary. Pip squeaked like a wind-up toy. Luna, of course, supervised from a footstool throne. Miles and Isabel held each end of the blanket, rocking back and forth, laughing. Then, during a lull, Miles leaned against the couch and watched Brave try stubbornly, hilariously, to drag the whole blanket by himself. "I feel," he started, throat thick. Raya settled beside him, head against his calf. He stroked her head. "I feel like I belong." Isabel didn't speak. She just placed her hand over his forearm. "You do," she said. And somehow, he believed her not because of the words, but because the room itself seemed to nod in agreement. Brave toddled over, collapsed onto Miles's boot, and fell asleep. Miles lifted him gently, resting the pup against his chest. Brave sighed and nuzzled under his chin. Time paused. The room held its breath. Outside, rain slowed to a mist. Inside, loneliness finally lifted, replaced by something sturdy, unspoken, and real. That night, the house exhaled. The hearth hummed low. The pups sprawled in a warm heap beneath the table. Brave dozed half inside Raya's old slipper. Raya slept nearby, ear cocked, always listening. Isabel moved quietly through the house, extinguishing lamps, smoothing quilt corners, and straightening chairs. In the hush, the house felt held together not just by beams and nails, but by breath and trust. She sat at the kitchen table, journal open, candle flickering. The pen in her hand hesitated, then moved. Rain and mud everywhere, but the pup saw a playground. Brave discovered his name. Miles fixed broken board sand, broke something loose in all of us. He laughs now, with his whole chest. I watched him today and realized what I hadn't dared to admit. He needed them. They needed him. And I needed them both. She stared at the sentence. It felt carved in stone. For years, she'd survived by rituals, quilts, and tea, garden rows, and solo walks, but none of it replaced footsteps in another room. Then came the pups, and the man with tired eyes and calloused hands. What they brought wasn't just sound, it was conversation, even in silence. She turned the page. Tonight I marked time by Brave dragging a blanket. Progress isn't always grand. Sometimes it's a runt refusing to surrender. A floorboard creaked. She looked up. Miles stood in the hall, blanket draped around his shoulders. "Didn't mean to snoop," he whispered. "Thought I smelled candle smoke." She smiled. "Only journaling. House is safe." He knelt to adjust Scout's paw, then turned back toward the couch. She watched him go, then added one last line. "He checks on them, even half asleep." That's what fathers do. She closed the journal, blew out the candle, and stood. The house fell into soft darkness, stitched together by quiet breath and shared warmth. As she passed the couch, Miles stirred. "Everything okay?" he murmured. She paused, hand brushing the back of the couch. "Everything's right where it needs to be," she whispered. Raya's tail gave one soft thump. Isabel smiled into the dark and climbed the stairs, leaving behind a home finally whole, not because nothing was broken, but because someone had returned to help mend it. The creek greeted them like a lullaby, clear and cool, its current whispering past polished stones. 5 nearly grown pups tumbled down the bank, followed by their mother, Raya, who moved with quiet command. Behind her came Miles, his hands resting lightly on leashes that weren't really needed. The dogs listened to him now, like needles drawn north. Beside him, Isabel tipped back her sun hat. "Field trip," she whispered, as if naming it aloud would make the peace last. Raya stepped into the water first, rippling her reflection. The pups hesitated, then dove in tank with a splash, Luna gliding like silk, scout-testing currents. Pip yelped with joy, flailing, then floating. Brave, the smallest, looked to Miles. At his nod, the pup stepped forward, chest proud. Water erupted with yips and laughter. Miles stood still, reverent. He remembered this very bend as a place of guilt, where sorrow had once crouched like a shadow. But today the air rang with light. Forgiveness, he thought, might sound like this: water, wind, and the bark of joy. Isabel lifted her camera. "Proof," she murmured, "in case we ever forget how far we came." He touched the scar on his wrist. Same place, new world. Later, they collapsed on a warm sandbar. Tongues lolled, paws twitched. Brave snored, with a leaf on his nose. Raya rested apart, eyes half closed, listening to a current she knew by heart. Miles knelt beside her, hand on her damp shoulder. There was still an apology between them, but it had changed, no longer a wound, but a current moving forward. Isabel poured lemonade from a thermos. To fresh water over old wounds. They toasted. The pup slept. Scout's eyes stayed half open, as always. Miles scanned the creek. This place used to be a nightmare reel. Isabel smiled. "Thank them," she said, nodding toward the pile of sleeping fur. "They rewrote it." A breeze moved through the alder trees. Time to head back. "Ready?" Miles asked. Raya answered with a soft bark. The pups rose, yawning, bumping each other playfully. Miles gathered the leashes, but let them hang loose. Together, they climbed the bank. At the top, he paused and looked back at the bend in the creek that had once nearly taken him. The water shimmered with memory, but now carried laughter. They left the pups with Raya's watchful eye and walked downstream to the old log. Months ago, Miles had sat here with an empty bottle and a weight that pinned his chest. Now he sat beside Isabel, the wood no longer heavy with grief, but softened by moss and time. "Everything looks the same," he said, "but I see different colors now." "That's the heart adjusting its eyes," she answered. "Grief sees gray, healing sees green." He turned a pebble in his palm. "Back then, I thought the ache was the only honest thing left in me. But maybe it was just a signal, like nerves reminding a limb it still belongs." They watched the ripples. A dragonfly skimmed the surface. Isabel said, "You came full circle. Most people don't." "Maybe," he replied. "But circles don't end. They keep curving." He looked at her. "I'm still walking, but not alone." She folded her hands in her lap. "You stayed through the hard parts. You showed up even when it would have been easier to disappear." He chuckled. "I stay now because leaving would hurt more." She smiled. "You found the map out of a maze you built yourself." He looked at the creek, same place. Rewritten story. Then he said quietly, "They offered me the apprenticeship." Her face lit up. "You're going to take it?" He nodded. "I keep hearing old doubts. But then I think of Brave, dragging that blanket. Or Tank guarding the porch like it mattered. Or you, patching everything with hope." He exhaled. "I think I can." "You can," she said. And if the doubts return, bring them here. Let the creek argue back. As the sun lowered, the pups emerged from the trees, chasing each other like shadows made of joy. Miles sat on a fallen log. Raya leaned against him. Isabel joined quietly, basket in hand. The clearing glowed with apricot and rose as the forest exhaled. Tank somersaulted into leaves, Pip barked at sunbeams, Brave pounced on a stick. Scout paraded a feather like a banner. Every leap rewrote an old memory. Eventually, they settled warm piles of fur and dreams. Brave climbed onto Miles's boot and fell asleep there, tiny sigh of trust curling into Miles's bones. Raya laid her head on his knee. Isabel watched them all, her eyes shining. "You've come home," she said. Miles couldn't speak. He simply stroked Raya's head and let his silence say thanks. The woods answered in quiet. The hush of the creek, an owl's rustle, the gentle closing of day. Stars pierced the sky. Miles looked up and remembered desert night show brightness once made him feel more alone. Tonight, the stars felt like lanterns guiding him toward a hearth he hadn't known he'd needed. He looked at Isabel, saw her watching the same sky, and understood. Home wasn't a place. It was a choice. To stay, to forgive, to open the door and not close it again. Raya nudged him gently. He smiled, leaned close to Brave, and whispered something the night kept secret. Isabel poured soup from the basket. They sipped under the stars, letting quiet finish the sentence. Some circles break, others widen. This one held. Morning broke, with a hush too bright to ignore, the kind of light that slips beneath curtains and insists on new chapters. Isabel was already in the kitchen, measuring coffee grounds by feel, while Miles taped a sign to the front gate. Puppy meet and greet adoption. Day written in careful letters. Dew sparkled on fresh mown grass, and a low breeze carried the scent of lilac through the open windows. Inside, 5 young German Shepherd mixes paced and tumbled in circles of confused excitement, noses twitching at unfamiliar preparations. Miles glanced at the pups, then at Raya, who lay near the doorway like a queen accepting courtiers. Her eyes tracked every flurry of activity, ears pricking each time a bowl clinked or a box shifted. If she sensed the day's significance, she betrayed it only in the slow, steady sweep of her tail, half reassurance, half pride. They had spent the previous night assembling take-home kits, small blankets cut from the old patchwork quilt, folders of vet records, photos of each pup at 3 stages so new families could see beginnings. Isabel wrote the names Tank, Luna, Scout, Pippin looping script on craft tags. Brave's tag remained in the kitchen drawer, untouched. "Ready?" Miles asked, stepping over a cluster of wagging tails to hand Isabel a thermos. His voice held a tremor he hoped the dogs wouldn't notice. "As will ever be," she said, offering a tight smile. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "People should start arriving soon." Cars rolled up the gravel drive one by one. A young couple clutching a leash and a bag of toys. A middle-aged woman with ink-stained fingers who spoke softly about writing children's books. A retired firefighter whose steady hands belied the nervous quiver in his grin. Each new arrival was greeted by Miles's measured calm and Isabel's warm explanation of Temperament's Tank's enthusiasm, Luna's poise, Scout's analytical curiosity, Pip's exuberant affection. Raya stood at Miles's side as introductions were made, offering a sniff, a gentle nudge, seeming to stamp each human with approval. Brave hovered near her flank, gaze darting between strangers and his littermates. When a toddler squealed at Tank's goofy grin, Brave tucked himself closer to Raya, small body vibrating as though absorbing her steadiness. Adoption paperwork unfolded under the shade of the apple tree. Isabel distributed folders. Miles answered questions about diet and training schedules. Cheers rose when Scout trotted off beside the rider, head high as though already composing tales of adventure. Luna climbed into the firefighter's truck with dignified confidence. Tank bounded into the couple's hatchback, scattering plush toys across the back seat. Pip wiggled into the arms of a teen who promised beach runs and endless tennis balls. With each departure, Raya watched eyes bright, tail wagging once, twice, then returning to stillness. Miles knelt beside her after Scout's car disappeared down the drive. "You okay, partner?" he murmured. She bumped his chin with her nose, a quiet answer that felt like both ache and affirmation. The yard fell silent when the last car drove away, leaving only Brave sitting in the grass, ears half up, studying Isabel and Miles as though awaiting instructions. The small pup's tag still rested in the kitchen drawer. Isabel knelt, calling softly. Brave trotted over, but instead of climbing into her lap, he veered and scrambled onto Miles's boot, the same perch he'd claimed under Sunset weeks before. He curled there, spine pressed to leather, eyes closing with a sigh. Miles met Isabel's gaze over the pup's dozing head. "Looks like he's made his choice," he said, voice thick. Isabel's smile wavered, caught between joy and farewell. "Some bonds refuse scissors," she whispered. Even on adoption day, they carried the remaining blankets and empty crates back into the cottage. In the doorway, Raya paused to nose the quilt square labeled Brave before Miles tucked it into his jacket pocket. She gave a rumble so soft it felt like a purr, then followed her son and the man who'd once walked away but now stayed. Inside, the house felt larger and oddly quiet. Sunlight pooled on the floor where 5 pups had wrestled that morning. Only a single set of tiny paw prints tracked through the dust. Miles lowered Brave onto a cushioned basket near the stove. The pup blinked up at him, yawned, and immediately fell asleep, trusting the world to remain intact around his dreams. Isabel set 2 mugs on the table and sat. Miles joined her, and for a minute they listened to the tick of the wall clock, the hush of wind, the steady breathing of Raya as she settled beside Brave's basket. The emptiness where the others had tumbled was palpable, but it wasn't hollow. It was spacious, like ground tilled for something new. Isabel wrapped her fingers around her mug. "We did it," she said softly. Miles exhaled, shoulders easing. They're with families who'll love them. He looked at Brave, tiny chest rising, and this one's family chose him back. Raya lifted her head at the sound, eyes meeting Miles's pride, radiated from her calm gaze a regal acceptance that the circle had closed as it was meant to. Miles reached to stroke her ears, then Brave's downy back. Emotion gathered in his throat, a knot of loss and gratitude intertwining. "Goodbyes hurt less," he whispered, "when the story keeps going at home." Raya laid her head on his foot. Brave nuzzled closer, and Isabel touched Miles's arm. The cottage, though quieter, brimmed with the echo of laughter just past, and the heartbeat of bonds unbroken. Farewells had begun, but in their wake, new beginnings unfurled, soft, steady, and unmistakably theirs. Twilight seeped through the kitchen windows in slow lavender waves, tinting the room with a hush that felt equal parts weary and hopeful. Dinner dishes were stacked to dry. Brave lay curled in a ring of lamplight, and Raya sprawled in the doorway like a guardian whose shift had eased from alertness to watchful rest. Isabel rinsed the last plate, turned off the faucet, and stood for a moment, palms pressed to cool porcelain, listening to the house breathe. Behind her, Miles sorted through a small pile of mail job program leaflets, a postcard from the shelter vet, and one envelope addressed in a child's rounded handwriting that he had not yet found the courage to open. He slipped the envelope into his pocket, then closed the folder on the counter. A faint smile touched his lips when he caught Brave's sleepy blink. Isabel dried her hands, reached into the junk drawer, and pulled out an old brass key on a green ribbon. The metal shone dull with age, edges softened by years of turning in the back lock. She waited in her palm, hearing, perhaps, echoes of doors opened for stray cats, friends in need, and the man she'd loved before grief took up residence. Then she crossed to Miles, who looked up at the hush of her footsteps. She held the key out, ribbon dangling like a question. "The guest room's yours," she said, voice as steady as the wood stove simmering behind them. "No rent, just responsibility for the leaky gutter and maybe morning coffee if you beat me to it." Miles stared at the key as though it were a fragile relic. His throat bobbed. "Isabel, He cleared his voice, tried again. "I can't promise perfection. Some nights I still wake up choking on the past. Some days I forget the difference between guilt and memory." A wan grin rose. "Apologetic. You might regret giving me that door." Isabel's smile curved, gentle but unflinching. "I'm not asking for perfection," she answered. "Only progress." The words hovered between them, soft yet weighty, like quilt batting stitched with purpose. Outside, a whippoorwill cried, punctuating the silence. Raya's ears flicked, but she remained settled, as if she too awaited Miles's answer. He took the key, It was heavier than brass dents, with invitation and the hum of things rebuilt. The ribbon slid through his fingers, brushing a scar across his knuckles. He closed his hand around the metal, felt its coolness ground him. Progress, he echoed, tasting the promise. I can aim for that. A breath he hadn't noticed holding escaped. He looked at the refrigerator, a magnet-pinned photo of Tank with his new family. Luna perched regal on a fire truck. Scout sprawled on an author's desk. Pip sprinting across a beach. Brave was absent from the collage only because he was here, sprawled at their feet, tiny chest rising in contented rhythm. The photos were proof progress captured in glossy ink. Guest rooms above the stairs, Isabel said, tilting her head toward the hallway. Fresh sheets, though the quilt has some puppy teeth marks. Closets half empty. Figured you might need the other half. He nodded, swallowing a sudden thickness in his throat. Guess I'll unpack the bike bags. His gaze traveled the warm lamplight, the scars in the floor, the patched curtain-severy imperfection, a fingerprint of survival. Feels like moving into a heartbeat, he whispered. Isabel's laugh was small, almost shy. It's an old pulse, she said, but it's steady. She reached to straighten the ribbon still clinging to his fist. Consider it a lease on forgiveness renewed daily. Miles's eyes shone damp, but his smile steadied. Daily is doable. He slipped the key into his pocket beside the unopened envelope. Progress, he thought, was sometimes as simple as turning one key before daring to break another seal. Raya rose then, shaking out her coat in a ripple of soft thuds. She walked to Miles, nudged his hand once, and ambled toward the hall, glancing back as if to say, "Shift, change your watch." Brave roused, toddled after her, then changed course and anchored himself on Miles's boot. Man and dog exchanged a look that needed no words. Miles lifted Brave into the crook of his arm. "Come on, roommate," he murmured. "Let's see if the guest bed squeaks less than the couch." He met Isabel's gaze, warmth pooling there. "Thank you," he said, two syllables freighted with roads walked and doors reopened. She answered with a soft nod. "Lights are on a pull chain," she called as he moved toward the stairs. "And if the roof groans, it's just the wind reminding us it lives here too." He paused at the threshold. Brave curled against his chest, Key rubbing a steady circle over denim. "Good night, Isabel." "Good night, Miles," she replied. "Welcome home, Em." He climbed the stairs, each tread creaking like a new line written into their shared story. Isabel lingered by the kitchen table, touching the vacant space where the key had rested moments before. In its absence, she felt not loss but a gentle realignment of the house's pulse, stronger now, steadier, beating to the rhythm of progress promised and at last believed. Morning mist lifted off the meadow like a veil, revealing the cottage at the center of a quiet hum of new routines. A shaft of light pierced the living room window, pooling across the braided rug where Raya lay sprawled on her side, muzzle nestled against her paws. The firebox glowed behind its gratino fierce flames, just a bed of coals breathing soft heat. Brave, lanky now but still half-sized, curled against her belly, his nose buried in the ruff of her fur. Together they looked like punctuation marks at the end of a long, miraculous sentence. Outside, hammer taps punctuated birdsong. Miles straddled the porch rail, sleeves rolled, tongue worried between his teeth as he measured and set a new baluster. Sawdust dusted his forearms, mingling with freckles of sunlight that filtered through budding maples overhead. Each nail he drove erased a wobble left there by seasons of neglect. Each plank he sanded smoothed a snag that could catch a careless hand. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt, but his eyes were bright, fixed on leveled lines and true angles evidence that steady work could rewrite the memory of splintered nights. A few yards away, Isabel knelt among freshly turned earth, trowel in one hand, tray of seedlings in the other. She pressed root balls into loam beside the crooked fence Miles had mended weeks earlier, patting soil around stems of marigold and lavender. Each plant was a promise. Bursts of orange to fend off garden pests, purple spikes to lure bees. Her knees ached, but the ache felt purposeful, pages turning in muscles, rewriting the story of a body that had carried too much quiet for too long. A montage unfolded in the slow choreography of ordinary blessing. Miles pauses, straightens, catches his breath. He wipes sweat with the back of his wrist and gazes toward the creek line, where winter's ghosts once lingered. The morning light breaks through trees, gilding grass. He exhales, shoulders settling as though they've finally learned their own shape. Inside, Brave stirs, ears flicking. He pads to the hearth's edge, stretches in a bow, then noses Raya. She opens one eye, licks his forehead, and lets him tug the tip of her ear in playful invitation before rising to follow him into the kitchen. Isabel sets the last marigold, stands, and brushes soil from her gloves. She surveys the row straight, bright, alive. A smile lifts her cheeks, soft and sure. The porch rail complete, Miles descends the steps and meets Isabel by the flower bed. He kneels beside her, dropping a handful of wood shavings that mingle with earth as natural mulch. Their shoulders bump. They share a quiet laugh that floats up and settles among chattering sparrows. Later, Miles slides a letter from his jacket. New stationery. Neat script, addressed to his daughter. He tucks it into the mailbox at the lane, flag raised. The red marker glints beneath sunbeams, a small signal of courage sent down the road. Inside, Raya circles the pup's now spacious pen and leave Brave left, but blankets still arranged for all five. She noses a frayed rope toy toward him. He pounces, tail wagging. Mother and son tumble together, jaws gentle, growls playful. As afternoon drifts toward gold, Isabel brings out lemonade. They sit on the fixed steps, Miles, Isabel, Raya at their feet. Brave sprawled beside her. Beyond the yard, the creek flashes in glimpses through trees, a ribbon of light and sound that once carried despair but now whispers lullabies to roots and stones. Miles tips his head back, watching clouds slide slow. Strange, he murmurs. How forgiveness feels heavier than guilt at first, then lighter than air once you lean into it. Isabel swirls her straw, ice clinking. That's because forgiveness didn't erase the past, she says, voice soft but sure. But it built a bridge to something better. He turns, meeting her gaze. In her eyes, he sees reflected the porch rail, the seedlings, the dozing dogs, the tangible architecture of the bridge she named. He nods, wordless, feeling the boards solid beneath them, the future stretching forward like the lane beyond the mailbox. Evening settles, and the family drifts indoors. Miles feeds the hearth, coaxing a gentle blaze. Brave curls on his repaired boot, eyelids drooping. Raya stretches out, flank rising and falling in serene rhythm. Isabel closes her journal, leaves tonight's page blanca space, not for sorrow or fear, but for whatever tomorrow decides to write. Outside, stars bloom across the deepening sky, mirrored dimly in the slow creek. The house stands lit from within, each window a lantern casting warmth onto grass where marigolds wait to open at dawn. The bridge of forgiveness built of nails, seedlings, letters, and licks arches, unseen between then and now, sturdy enough to carry them all. When all is said and done, what lingers isn't the noise of the day but the quiet warmth of a dog's head resting on your knee. German shepherds remind us that loyalty can survive the worst storms and still greet us with a wagging tail. Their devotion is a gentle nudge. Love is an action, practiced minute by minute, paw print by paw print. And in giving that love back, whether through a game of fetch, a repaired porch rail, or simply sitting together beside the fire, we find our own hearts mended in ways we never expected. If you ever feel like deepening that bond with the dog who's already woven into your life, you might enjoy leafing through the American Kennel Club's free Canine Good Citizen Guide. I've kept a dog-eared copy on my coffee table for years. It's as comforting as a well-worn quilt and full of tiny ideas that make everyday moments richer. Take a look when the mood feels right and give your good girl or boy an extra scratch from me. Here's to more shared sunsets, softer nights, and bridges built by paws and hands together.